Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity settles in, the world grows a little quieter, and science takes its time. Tonight, we are drifting far from the shoreline and slipping into an older ocean, one that no human eye ever saw, though its story still waits for us in stone. Our companion for this slow descent is not a whale, not a crocodile, and not quite the sea dragon people sometimes imagine when they first hear its name. It is Mosasaurus, one of the largest and most formidable marine reptiles of the late Cretaceous, a creature whose remains have helped paleontologists piece together a world in which giant predatory reptiles ruled the seas. Mosasaurs were marine lizards, not dinosaurs, and they lived during the Cretaceous period, which ended about 66 million years ago. There is something about the phrase, the ocean predator that could swallow sharks, that immediately gets the imagination moving, isn't there? It sounds almost too dramatic, the kind of line that feels as though it ought to come with thunder, crashing waves, and someone shouting from the deck of a ship. But the truth behind it is more interesting than a slogan, because it takes us into a real prehistoric sea filled with real predators, real competition, and an animal that did not need exaggeration to be impressive. Mosasaurs were carnivorous marine reptiles, and the most famous forms grew to extraordinary sizes. One Britannica entry notes that the longest mosasaurs, based on a specimen of Mosasaurus hoffmanni, have been estimated at around 17 metres, though estimates vary. That does not mean every Mosasaurus reached such lengths, but it does tell us we are dealing with something genuinely immense. Before we go any further, I would love for you to take a small pause and notice your own surroundings for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere near the coast, where the sea feels like a familiar neighbour? Or are you many miles inland, tucked away from salt and tide and gulls and harbour lights? And what time is it in your part of the world right now? There is something fitting about that, I think. A story about an ancient animal that moved through vanished oceans, arriving quietly in your room at your hour after your day has already asked enough of you. Perhaps you're listening under a blanket. Perhaps there is rain outside. Perhaps the house is still. Perhaps a cup of tea has gone lukewarm nearby in the deeply universal way that tea seems to do the moment you stop paying attention to it. If you find this gentle journey soothing or interesting, or simply a pleasant way to let the mind loosen its grip on the day, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed as well. It helps this calm little corner reach other listeners who might also enjoy ending the evening with an ancient sea reptile rather than, say, checking emails for the 12th time. A questionable bedtime choice in one sense perhaps, but in another, an excellent one. After all, if you are going to wander through dangerous waters before sleep, you may as well do it from the safety of a pillow. Now then, let us ease into the subject properly, because Mosasaurus tends to arrive in the mind fully formed. A giant mouth, a long body, dark water, something enormous moving just beneath the surface. Most people meet it first not through paleontology, but through cinema, museum posters, childhood books, or a general sense that the ancient world was full of creatures that would have been very inconvenient to bump into while swimming. And yet, when we pause and look carefully, the real animal becomes even more striking than the simplified version. Not because it was a fantasy beast, quite the opposite. Because it was a living reptile shaped by a real ocean, a real food web, and millions of years of evolution that turned a land-related lizard lineage into an efficient marine hunter. The Natural History Museum notes that mosasaurs were close cousins of modern snakes and lizards, and that they dominated the oceans toward the end of the dinosaurs' reign on land. That detail alone changes the mood, does it not? Not a dinosaur, not a whale, not some odd reptilian fish, a marine lizard, a relative, however distant and transformed, of the scaled animals we still know today. There is something wonderfully unsettling about that. It takes the familiar and stretches it far past comfort. A lizard on a garden wall is one thing. A lizard reworked by evolution into a massive ocean predator is another matter altogether. The same broader branch of life, but with the volume turned up to an alarming level. It is a reminder that nature does not always invent from scratch. Sometimes it modifies, it extends, it reshapes, it takes a body plan and says, right then, what if we made this faster, larger, more aquatic and much harder to be around if you happen to be edible? And what a place to become such a thing. The Cretaceous world was not only the age of famous land dinosaurs, it was also a time when marine reptiles thrived and the seas held their own giants, hunters and specialists. Britannica notes that giant marine reptiles such as mosasaurs were common in the seas during the Cretaceous, while the Smithsonian describes Cretaceous seas such as those off ancient Angola as dominated by many species of large carnivorous marine reptiles. That is important, because it reminds us that Mosasaurus did not evolve into an empty ocean like the first person arriving early to a party. It entered a crowded, dangerous, competitive environment where being impressive was not enough. One had to survive among other capable hunters. This is where the image of swallowing sharks starts to make more sense. Not as a campfire boast, but as shorthand for a very serious ecological role. When people hear that phrase, they picture a monster so large and powerful that even other predators were not safe from it. And that, broadly speaking, is the territory we are entering. Not because every shark in every ancient sea lived in terror of one specific Mosasaurus at all times, but because these animals occupied the upper levels of marine food webs and were built to seize substantial prey. The Smithsonian's ocean resources describe mosasaurs as huge marine lizards and carnivorous marine reptiles in Cretaceous seas, while museum summaries and paleontological overviews consistently place them among the dominant marine predators of their time. Still, the mind always wants a scene, so let us build one slowly and without too much drama. No storm required, no panicked orchestra, just late Cretaceous water under a bright sky. Warm seas spreading over parts of the continents, life above and below the surface moving according to rhythms older than mammals, older than grasslands as we know them, older than the modern coastlines that make our maps feel solid. Somewhere beneath that surface a large body moves with purpose, not hurried, not frantic. It does not need to be. A top hunter is not always the loudest thing in the room. Often it is the quietest, the one that conserves effort, the one that lets anatomy do the work, the one that does not advertise itself until the distance has already closed. This, I think, is one reason prehistoric marine predators fascinate people so deeply. Land predators are frightening in a straightforward way. You can at least imagine the ground, the trees, the path, the distance between you and them. The sea is different. It removes the reassuring structure of the world. Down is open. Visibility fails. Sound changes. Movement becomes less certain. Scale becomes harder to judge. Even a perfectly ordinary fish can look faintly suspicious when it appears from below. Place that feeling in a Cretaceous ocean and enlarge it until the hunter in question may have rivaled a bus in length on some estimates, and you begin to see why Mosasaurus has such a hold on the imagination. Yet I do not want to rush towards spectacle, because the real pleasure here is in the details. It is one thing to say giant predator and let the mind fill in the rest. It is another to understand how such an animal actually existed, how its skull was arranged, how its body moved, how its ancestry ties it to squamates rather than dinosaurs, how fossil discoveries from Europe and other parts of the world helped reveal not a legend, but an actual lineage of marine reptiles distributed widely during the Cretaceous. Britannica describes mosasaurs as aquatic lizards adapted to marine life and distributed worldwide during that period, and the Natural History Museum explains that mosasaurs are named after Mosasaurus, the most famous member of the group. That naming is worth lingering on for a moment, because it gives the animal a curious double life. On the one hand, Mosasaurus is a genus, a scientific name anchored in anatomy, classification, and fossil evidence. On the other hand, it has become a kind of public symbol for the entire idea of giant sea reptiles. Much as people sometimes use one famous cat to picture all big cats, or one famous shark to stand in for the whole concept of sharkness, Mosasaurus often carries more cultural weight than the taxonomic label strictly requires. That is understandable. It is a good name. Strong, memorable, slightly ominous, without trying too hard. A name that sounds as though it knows exactly what it is doing, and people have been captivated by it for quite a long time. The Natural History Museum notes that an extraordinary fossil discovery made by Dutch miners in the 18th century played a major role in bringing mosasaurs into scientific awareness. That early history matters because Mosasaurus did not emerge from folklore into science, it emerged from rock into science. Bit by bit, bone by bone, jaw by jaw, through the work of collectors, naturalists, anatomists, and later paleontologists who had to make sense of an animal unlike anything alive in the sea today. That process, in its own quieter way, is every bit as dramatic as the animal itself. Imagine seeing such remains for the first time without a modern framework to explain them. You would know at once that they belong to something large, predatory, and marine. Beyond that, the puzzle would widen quickly. What kind of head did it carry? How did it swim? Was it more like a crocodile, a whale, a fish, or a lizard? What did it hunt? How did it catch it? Did it patrol coastlines, chase prey in open water, ambush from below, or do some combination depending on the species and the situation? These are the kinds of questions that make prehistoric animals feel real, because they move us past the poster image and into the daily business of being alive. Every predator, no matter how huge, must solve practical problems. It must find food often enough. It must avoid wasting energy. It must compete. It must grow. It must survive injury. It must begin life small enough to be vulnerable before becoming large enough to make others vulnerable in turn. Grandeur is only part of the story. Logistics is the rest. That too is why the ocean setting matters so much. Marine life demands its own engineering. Water supports weight, yes, but it also resists motion. A successful marine hunter is a solution to a constant physical argument between drag, thrust, turning, acceleration, breath, temperature, and prey behavior. The Smithsonian has highlighted how ancient sea lizards such as mosasaurs evolved body forms that in some ways echoed the functional demands seen in modern marine animals, not because they were closely related to whales, for example, but because the sea rewards certain designs. Streamlining matters, tail-driven movement matters, control matters. If you are going to become a dominant marine predator, the water will have strong opinions about how you do it. And this is where the story starts to become pleasantly humbling. Because as modern humans, we are very good at being impressed by size in a general sense. Large mountain, large building, large reptile. Very good. But ancient predators ask for a more specific kind of respect. Not merely, look how big, but look how well made for the life it lived. The jaws were not just large, they were part of a feeding system. The teeth were not just sharp, they were tools shaped by diet. The body was not just long, it was tuned for movement through water. The animal was not simply scary, it was effective. And effectiveness in nature is always more interesting than simple ferocity, because it tells you something about the world that's selected for it. So when people say Mosasaurus could swallow sharks, what they are really doing, perhaps without realizing it, is reaching for a shorthand expression of scale, power, and ecological dominance. They're trying to describe an animal that lived beyond ordinary modern experience. Most of us have some mental reference points for lions, crocodiles, wolves, eagles, sharks, and whales. Even if we have not seen them in the wild, we know the categories. Mosasaurus breaks those easy boxes. It borrows a little from several and settles comfortably into none. It was reptilian, marine, predatory, large, and late in Earth's long age of reptiles. It belonged to a world that was full of familiar biological logic and utterly unfamiliar combinations of animals. That is part of the thrill. It feels both understandable and deeply strange. There is also a practical reason the animal stays with people. The sea, even now, has not surrendered its full mystery. We map it, dive in it, photograph it, track animals through it, and still vast portions of it remain unseen in any ordinary human sense. Prehistoric oceans multiply that distance. We are not only separated by depth, but by time. No witness can step forward. No filmed encounter exists. We have fossils, sediments, teeth marks, comparisons, anatomy, and carefully built inference. From that evidence, a picture emerges. Never perfect, never complete, but solid enough to show us that the ancient seas were not empty blue backdrops beneath the age of dinosaurs. They were contested ecosystems filled with formidable life. Mosasaurs, including Mosasaurus, were among the predators that helped define those systems, which means that the story before us is not merely the story of one large reptile with a memorable head. It is the story of a whole environment that made such an animal possible. Water temperature, sea level, prey abundance, competition, evolutionary opportunity, extinction waiting far ahead but not yet visible to anything alive within the system. A hunter does not exist on its own. It is made by context. To understand Mosasaurus properly, we have to resist the temptation to leap straight for the teeth and stay there. Tempting though that may be. Very tempting. The teeth are excellent at grabbing the attention after all, and they knew it then just as surely as they know it now. Still, let us not be unfair. Teeth have earned their reputation. The public image of Mosasaurus often begins with the mouth, because the mouth is the point at which predator and prey finally stop being theory and become outcome. Yet even that famous image can mislead if we are not careful. A giant mouth on its own tells us very little unless we know what the rest of the head was doing, how the jaws closed, how the teeth were set, and what sort of food the animal was equipped to handle. These are matters for later, and they are worth taking slowly. Because once you begin to see Mosasaurus not as a generic monster, but as a real marine reptile with a particular build and a particular role, the animal becomes larger in the mind, not smaller. Precision has that effect. It removes fantasy and replaces it with something sturdier. For now, it is enough to settle into the broad outline. Late Cretaceous seas. A marine reptile, not a dinosaur. A member of the mosasaur group related more closely to snakes and lizards than to the famous giants on land. A predator of great size in a world where size alone did not guarantee success. Fossils that have turned scattered bone into a coherent picture over centuries of study. A reputation that has only grown with time, because the basic idea is hard to resist. What if one of the most memorable hunters in natural history did not run across the ground, but moved through seawater with the quiet confidence of something built to take possession of it? And before we get too attached to the silhouette of the animal itself, it helps to step back and look at the world that held it. Because Mosasaurus did not rise in isolation. It belonged to an ocean already full of life, risk, movement and opportunity, and that ancient setting is where the real scale of the story starts to come into focus. And that world was not a single endless blue sheet with one giant reptile drifting through it, like the only actor on stage. The late Cretaceous seas were crowded, warm and busy, and in many places they spread far across the continents in ways that are difficult to picture from a modern map. Sea levels were much higher than they are now, and during the late Cretaceous marine waters flooded large parts of North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Russia and Australia, creating shallow epicontinental seas across regions that are land today. At times, so much of the continental margin lay underwater that land covered only about 18% of Earth's surface, compared with roughly 28% today. This was not an ocean world in the science fiction sense, but it was a planet with a great deal more shallow sea than we are used to imagining, and that changed everything for the animals living in and around it. The climate helped make those seas what they were. The Cretaceous was generally warmer than the modern world, with weaker temperature differences between equator and poles than we see today, and with little to no permanent ice outside high mountains. Britannica notes that surface waters near the equator may have stayed around 30 degrees Celsius year-round, while even polar waters were far milder than modern ones. That meant marine habitats could stretch broadly, and it also meant that warm, shallow seas became some of the defining environments of the period. When people think of the age of dinosaurs, they often picture dry land first, but beneath and around those land masses lay marine systems that were just as important, just as dynamic, and in many cases just as full of oversized appetites. It was a very favourable time to be a marine predator, though naturally a less favourable time to be the lunch of one. One of the clearest examples was the Western Interior Seaway, a broad body of water that covered the central part of North America for much of the late Cretaceous. It connected the ancient Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, and effectively divided North America into two land masses, Laramidia to the west and Appalachia to the east. The sea was relatively shallow, but shallow does not mean empty or harmless. Quite the opposite. Warm, shallow water can be remarkably productive, especially when fed by nutrients from nearby land and shaped by changing shorelines, deltas, and currents. Fossils from these sediments show that the seaway held fish, sharks, marine reptiles, birds, ammonites, bivalves, snails, echinoderms, and more. It was less like a blank inland flood and more like a sprawling marine province with its own neighbourhoods, its own hazards, and its own chain of command. And North America was only one part of the picture. Across the wider globe, Cretaceous seas linked habitats and created migration routes that no longer exist. Britannica notes that Arctic waters could at times connect to the Tethys Seaway through the middle of North America and central Russia, and marine animals of the South Atlantic could at certain times move toward Tethys through regions that are now parts of Africa. Large areas of what is now Europe, eastern Australia, and sections of Africa, South America, India, Madagascar and Borneo were underwater for some interval of Cretaceous time. So when we speak of the lost world beneath the Cretaceous waves, we are not speaking about one famous inland sea alone. We are speaking about a patchwork of shallow marine realms, open water routes, coastal shelves, reef systems, muddy bottoms, oxygen-poor zones, and deepening channels, all of them alive with movement. The seafloor itself could be surprisingly varied. In some regions, constantly shifting sediment built up broad, soft-bottom habitats. In others, reefs rose from the seafloor, though not always reefs in the way modern snorkelers might expect. Today, tropical reefs mean coral to most of us. In parts of the Cretaceous, however, major reef builders were rudis clams, unusual bivalves that often dominated over corals as framework builders in warm marine settings. Smithsonian Ocean describes rudis as the major molluscan reef builders of some Cretaceous seas, and Britannica notes that rudis-dominated reef-like structures marked important marine regions of the period. It is a nice reminder that ancient seas were familiar in function, but not in caste. The jobs were there: filter feeders, predators, scavengers, reef builders, plankton grazers. But the lineup of animals filling them could look quite different from anything a modern diver would meet. Above those reefs and seafloors drifted the countless small lives that held the larger system together. Marine plankton in the Cretaceous became strikingly modern in some respects. Coccolithophores grew so abundant in the late Cretaceous that their tiny calcium carbonate plates accumulated in huge quantities and helped form the chalk deposits that gave the Cretaceous its name. Planktonic foraminiferans also contributed greatly to fine-grained calcareous sediments. It is one of the most useful corrections to our usual picture of ancient giants. A sea full of monsters still depends on tiny drifting organisms. Before there can be large fish, there must be smaller food. Before there can be sharks and marine reptiles, there must be the vast, quiet engine of planktonic production. Even the biggest predator in the water is, in a roundabout way, dependent on things too small to see without help, which is humbling and practical all at once. Then there were the shell-bearing animals that have become some of the most recognisable signs of ancient seas: Ammonites and belemnites, Ammonites were numerous in Cretaceous waters and came in many forms, from the classic coiled shells to stranger heteromorph designs that looked more like corkscrews or bent tubes. They preyed on smaller animals and were in turn preyed upon by larger predators, including marine reptiles. Certain ammonites also became invaluable to paleontologists as index fossils because their forms changed through time in ways that help date marine rocks. Even a genus like baculites, with its distinctive partly straight shell, is known from late Cretaceous marine rocks and is used as a guide fossil for that interval. In life, though, ammonites were not geological tools, of course. They were living components of the marine food web, abundant enough and visible enough that any large predator cruising those waters would have known them very well indeed. Fish also filled these seas in impressive variety, and some of them were formidable in their own right. Britannica notes that sharks and rays were marine predators during the Cretaceous, as were ray-finned fishes, and that Xiphactinus grew to more than 4.5 metres, making it the largest known teleost fish. The Cretaceous Atlas similarly describes the western interior seaway as home to bony fish, including the enormous Xiphactinus, alongside sharks and marine reptiles. That matters because it prevents us from imagining a simple food web in which every large moving thing was reptilian. Some of the fish were already oversized, swift and well armed for predatory life. Some sharks occupied high trophic levels as well. This was not a sea where one group had the place entirely to itself. It was a sea of overlap, of competition, of species that sometimes hunted similar prey and sometimes each other, and of bodies shaped for sudden violence in open water. The reptiles that shared these waters added another layer of pressure. Plesiosaurs were still present, and in some places they remained major players. Ichthyosaurs, which had dominated earlier marine reptile chapters of the Mesozoic, persisted into the Cretaceous, but didn't make it to the end of the period. By the later part of the Cretaceous, mosasaurs had become especially prominent, eventually dominating many marine settings toward the end of the age of dinosaurs. The important point here is not simply that there were many reptilian predators, but that the balance among them changed through time. Ancient seas were not frozen displays in a museum case, they shifted. Groups rose, spread, diversified and declined. Ecological opportunities opened and closed. A predator entering that world was not entering a stable kingdom with one permanent ruler. It was entering an active contest. Even the water chemistry and the seafloor conditions could complicate the picture. The Cretaceous Atlas notes that parts of the western interior seaway periodically had anoxic conditions on the sea floor, meaning little or no oxygen. Britannica similarly points to diminished ocean circulation and black shale deposition during parts of the Cretaceous, suggesting that not all marine settings were equally healthy or equally oxygenated from top to bottom. That creates an interesting contrast. At the surface and in the water column, life could be abundant and dangerous. Down below, in certain intervals and locations, the seabed could become a difficult place to live. So the lost world beneath the waves was not uniformly pleasant or uniformly fertile. Some sectors were rich hunting grounds, others were more troubled, more stagnant, more chemically difficult. Ancient oceans, much like modern ones, were systems with gradients, boundaries, and bad neighbourhoods. If you had somehow floated above one of these Cretaceous shorelines at the right hour, the scene would not have resembled a modern beach holiday with a few extra teeth added for atmosphere. The coast might have been lined with muddy flats, lagoons, delta channels, and stretches of shallow sea pushing far inland. Birds moved above the water, including marine birds in some regions, while pterosaurs also flew overhead in places such as the western interior seaway. Beneath the surface, shelled cephalopods drifted or darted, fish hunted smaller fish, and larger animals moved through the murk with the sort of steady purpose that tends to mean trouble. The shoreline itself would have shifted with sediment and sea level. It was not a neat boundary. It was a broad working edge between land processes and marine life, and a perfect place for ecosystems to become both productive and perilous. What makes these seas especially useful to imagine is that they were not all open blue emptiness. Many of them were shallow enough for sediments to record fine details of changing environments. The rocks tell us about transgressions and regressions, sea advances and retreats, about volcanic ash layers settling into marine basins, and about the long history of coastlines moving back and forth. In the Western Interior Seaway, tectonic activity and rising seas helped create a large back-arc basin that repeatedly filled and shifted through the Cretaceous. Later, further tectonic activity and mountain building contributed to its final retreat. So the marine world that eventually held giant mosasaurs was never permanent. It was assembled over time, altered over time, and in the end dismantled. There is something useful in remembering that even vast ecosystems can be temporary when geology decides to rearrange the furniture. The animals living there had to keep up with all of this. They were not simply adapted to water in the broadest sense. They were adapted to particular marine settings, particular temperatures, particular prey, and particular ways of moving through a three-dimensional environment where danger could come from below, beside, or ahead. Some forms were better suited to open water. Others likely stayed closer to coastlines or shelves. Smithsonian coverage of mosasaurs points out that some species were adapted for cruising deep, open waters far from coasts, while other fossils are more often found in coastal settings where burial was more likely. That point is easy to miss when we talk too loosely about the sea, as if it were one place. In reality, ancient marine predators occupied different slices of it, just as modern marine animals do. One hunter's comfortable cruising ground might have been another animal's risky detour. There is also a scale issue that tends to get flattened in popular imagination. When people hear prehistoric ocean, they often skip straight to the largest animals and treat the rest as supporting decoration. But in ecological terms, the supporting cast is the story. Tiny plankton fed the system. Reef builders structured habitat. Shell-bearing cephalopods and bivalves multiplied and died in immense numbers. Fish occupied every size class from modest prey to serious predators. Sharks took their share. Marine reptiles entered as specialists, competitors, ambushers, cruisers, and apex hunters. The result was not a simple ladder with one creature at the top and everyone else politely waiting beneath it. It was a web with many tensions in it. That is why the best way to understand Mosasaurus is not to begin with the mouth, impressive though it certainly was, but with the sea that made such a mouth useful. And that sea, for all its warmth and abundance, was not indestructible. Toward the end of the Cretaceous, some marine systems were already changing as sea levels fell and major seaways shrank. Smithsonian Magazine summarizes research suggesting that as the Western Interior Seaway drained away, ecosystems there became harsher, with increased acidity and loss of plankton in some final phases. Then came the end Cretaceous extinction, which hit the oceans hard. Smithsonian Ocean notes that Ammonites, large marine reptiles, rudis clams, and many species of phytoplankton were particularly hard hit, while Britannica states that the extinction eliminated Ammonites, belemnites, mosasaurs, and plesiosaurs, among many other marine groups. So when we picture the lost world beneath the Cretaceous waves, we're also picturing a world that was already living on borrowed geological time, even if none of its animals had the slightest reason to know it. Still, while that ending matters, it is not where this stretch of the story begins. It begins in a sea that still works, still teems, still supports giant hunters and the prey they follow, a sea with warm shallows, drifting plankton, ammonites, fish, sharks, reefs built by clams rather than corals, birds overhead, occasional oxygen-starved bottoms below, and coastlines that keep moving just enough to make life interesting for everyone involved. Only after you hold that setting in your mind does the next step make proper sense, because once the world is in place, the animal itself can enter it clearly. And when it does, one fact matters immediately. For all the size and reputation it would eventually earn, Mosasaurus was not a dinosaur at all, but something stranger, and in some ways more interesting. Once that Cretaceous sea is in place in the mind, the next step is to clear away one of the biggest misunderstandings about Mosasaurus. It is very often spoken of as though it were a dinosaur, partly because it lived during the age of dinosaurs, partly because anything large and prehistoric tends to get pushed into that box, and partly because popular culture has never met a category it could not blur for dramatic effect. But Mosasaurus was not a dinosaur. The Natural History Museum is very direct about this. Mosasaurus and the other mosasaurs were marine reptiles, and more specifically they were squamates, the larger reptile group that includes lizards and snakes. In other words, if you were drawing its place on the tree of life, you would not put it beside Tyrannosaurus or Triceratops as a close cousin. You would place it in the broad lizard and snake side of reptile history, only heavily modified for life at sea. That does not make it less impressive. If anything, it makes it more surprising, because the real story is not that a dinosaur went for a swim. It is that a lizard lineage became one of the ocean's great predators. That distinction may sound simple when stated cleanly, but people were confused by the animal from the very beginning, and honestly, you can see why. When the earliest known Mosasaurus fossils were found near Maastricht in the 18th century, naturalists had no ready-made category waiting for them. According to the Natural History Museum, scientists variously suggested the bones might belong to a fish, a crocodile, or even a whale before the reptilian identity became clear. Adrien Camper recognised similarities with living reptiles, and Georges Cuvier later backed that interpretation, helping settle the matter in favour of the animal being a reptile rather than some giant fish or bizarre marine mammal. The fossil was formally named Mosasaurus in 1822, meaning Meuse lizard, after the river associated with Maastricht. It is one of those lovely historical details that tells you just how old this scientific conversation is. Mosasaurus was being argued over before the word dinosaur even existed. So the confusion people still have today is not exactly new. It is just wearing better graphics. The name itself can be a little misleading if you are not used to paleontology, because Mosasaurus is not the name for every big sea reptile of its kind. It is one genus within a larger family called Mosasauridae. The Natural History Museum explains that any member of that family is called a mosasaur, and that Mosasaurus is simply the best known representative, the one that gave the wider group its name. That is an important distinction. It is a bit like the difference between saying cat and tiger. One is the broader group, the other is a particular member within it. The museum also notes that mosasaurs are usually divided into several main groups, including mosasaurines, tylosaurines, halosaurines, plioplatycarpines, and tethysaurines. Mosasaurus belongs among the mosasaurines, which is one reason the animal often stands in for the whole family in the public imagination. It is famous, large, dramatic, and discovered early enough to have become a sort of ambassador for the group. But the wider mosasaur story includes many different body plans, tooth shapes, and ecological roles, not just one giant face full of bad news. Among living animals, the broadest honest comparison is to lizards and snakes, because that is the branch Mosasaurus comes from. The finer question, however, is a little trickier. The Natural History Museum notes that mosasaurs have very squamate-like skulls, including a characteristic lizard-like ear region, and they also had a highly mobile quadrate bone which allowed parts of the skull to move independently when handling prey. At the same time, the museum is careful to say that their exact place within the squamate family tree remains uncertain. There have long been arguments over whether they were closer to monitor lizard relatives, closer to snakes, or part of a branch that makes the answer less tidy than people would like. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the science. It is simply what happens when you're dealing with highly specialised extinct animals that took a successful body plan and pushed it very far in a marine direction. So if someone says Mosasaurus was basically a giant monitor lizard, that gets the mood roughly right, but the precision a bit wrong. If someone says it was basically a sea snake with flippers, that is also too neat. The accurate version is less flashy and more satisfying. It was a highly specialised marine squamate, and its exact nearest living style comparison is still debated. The whale comparison creates a different kind of confusion. People do not usually call Mosasaurus a whale because they think it belonged to the whale family tree. They do it because, at a glance, a large streamlined animal with flippers and a powerful tail looks whale-like. But resemblance is not the same thing as relationship. NOAA explains that whales are cetaceans, a group of marine mammals. Mosasaurus was a marine reptile. That is not a small technical difference tucked away in a footnote. It is a very deep biological split. The 2023 paleobiology study comparing mosasaurids with early cetaceans makes this point clearly by describing them as having deeply divergent phylogenetic affinities, even while showing some convergence in skull and feeding form. In plain language, they ended up looking similar in some ways, not because one came from the other, but because both lineages had to solve some of the same problems posed by marine hunting. Water rewards streamlining. Large aquatic predators tend to arrive at certain practical solutions. Nature is perfectly happy to reuse a good idea on unrelated branches, which is efficient of her, if a little confusing for the rest of us. That is why Mosasaurus is best understood not as a failed dinosaur, a fake whale, or an overgrown crocodile, but as an example of evolutionary convergence operating on reptilian material. Smithsonian Ocean discusses this by comparing ancient sea lizards and modern whales, noting that mosasaurs evolved features such as a crescent-shaped tail fluke as they became more efficient swimmers. The paleobiology paper goes further and explains that both mosasaurids and early cetaceans underwent similar broad transitions tied to aquatic life, including limb changes and a shift away from simpler body undulation toward more efficient tail-driven propulsion, even though they came from very different starting points. So when you picture Mosasaurus as kind of whale-like, there is a kernel of truth there, but it belongs to function, not ancestry. It is like seeing two very different tools that happen to have similarly shaped handles, because hands are hands and leverage is leverage. The handle does not mean one tool is secretly the other. It only means both were forced by physics to get practical. The sea has always been very firm about practical matters. Its deeper story begins on land, or at least close enough to land that limbs still made sense in the old-fashioned walking way. The Natural History Museum notes that mosasaurs were descended from squamates, and that their closest fossil relatives are generally placed among animals called agialosaurs. These reptiles show signs of a transition from land life to water life, with limbs still similar to those of more terrestrial lizards, but with long tails that probably help them swim. Over time, some of those forms developed flipper-like limbs and became more committed to the water, eventually giving rise to the first true mosasaurs. That is one of the most useful things classification can tell us. It tells us not only what an animal was, but what sort of problem its ancestors were trying to solve. Mosasaurus did not appear fully assembled like a studio monster lowered into a tank. It came from earlier lizard-like animals that were gradually reworked by selection as shallow marine environments offered opportunity. Feet became paddles. The body became more streamlined. The tail took on more importance. The old lizard blueprint was not discarded. It was revised, extended, and sent back into the water with more confidence each time. By the time we get to Mosasaurus itself, we are no longer dealing with something dabbling in marine life on weekends. We are dealing with a fully aquatic predator from the late Cretaceous. The Natural History Museum places the main mosasaur span between roughly 166 million years ago, with some of the oldest known fossils around 94 million years old, and the group surviving right up to the end Cretaceous extinction. Smithsonian Magazine likewise describes mosasaurs as widespread marine ambush predators that diversified after entering the oceans about 98 million years ago. That timing matters because it places Mosasaurus late in a successful marine radiation, not at the experimental beginning of it. This was not a half-finished trial animal still deciding whether the shore might be safer. It belonged to a lineage that had already spread widely and diversified into many forms. In that sense, calling Mosasaurus a marine lizard is correct, but it can sound too modest if you hear it quickly. A marine iguana is a marine lizard. Mosasaurus was a marine lizard in the way a military submarine is technically a boat. The words are true, but they undersell the engineering. Even the skull gives the game away once you know what to look for. The Natural History Museum emphasises the mobile quadrate bone and the squamate-style skull region, and it also notes that Mosasaurus had pterygoid teeth on the roof of its mouth, a feature also seen in snakes. Those details are not decorative. They tell us the animal retained deep squamate signatures, even while becoming one of the sea's dominant hunters. They also help explain why Mosasaurus could handle substantial prey. A skull that can move in useful ways is not merely an anatomical curiosity. It is part of a feeding system. That matters because people often imagine the animal in very simple terms, as though it were little more than a long body with a large jaw at one end. But classification reminds us that the jaw was attached to a particular evolutionary heritage. This was not just any predator mouth. It was a squamate predator mouth carried into a marine setting and then heavily specialised there. Once you recognise that, even the famous teeth start to look less like movie props and more like the end result of a very specific family history. And family history, even in reptiles, has a way of showing up in the face. Another clue that Mosasaurus was no whale comes from how the lineage appears to have reproduced. Modern whales are mammals. They nurse young and belong to a marine mammal lineage with its own very different history. Mosasaurs, by contrast, were marine reptiles, but they also seem to have been fully committed enough to ocean life that returning to shore to lay eggs was not part of the plan. Yale News reported on research identifying extremely young mosasaur specimens from open ocean deposits, supporting the view that mosasaurs gave birth to live young in the open sea, rather than hauling themselves onto beaches. The Natural History Museum likewise notes fossils of pregnant mosasaurs and states that these reptiles could give birth to live young in the open ocean. That point is easy to miss when people fixate only on size, but it is one of the clearest indicators of what Mosasaurus really was. It was not just an animal that hunted in the sea, it was an animal built to live its whole life there, from birth onward, in a way that marks a very advanced stage of marine adaptation for a reptile. Size adds one more layer of confusion, because large ocean animals tend to collapse together in popular memory. Once something is big enough, people start sorting by emotional reaction rather than anatomy. The Natural History Museum notes that the 5 recognised species of Mosasaurus vary in size, and that the type species, Mosasaurus hoffmanni, is thought to be the largest. Even then, the estimates are not perfectly settled. Some scientists have suggested lengths of 17 or 18 metres for the biggest individuals, while others consider around 11 to 12 metres more likely, and the same source notes that other named species of Mosasaurus were smaller, around 8 to 10 metres in some estimates. Britannica also describes Mosasaurus hoffmanni as the basis for some of the largest length estimates in the group. So when people imagine a single standard-sized Mosasaurus, the way they might imagine a standard taxi, that is not really how it works. There were species differences, individual differences, and the usual paleontological problem that skulls are often found more readily than the rest of the body. The animal was enormous by any ordinary standard, but even here the real version is more nuanced than the poster version. It also helps to remember that the category reptile can tempt people into the wrong modern analogies. A crocodile is a reptile, a sea turtle is a reptile, a snake is a reptile, a monitor lizard is a reptile. These animals are not interchangeable, and neither is Mosasaurus. It was not just a crocodile with better publicity, nor a snake with paddles, nor a sea turtle that had chosen violence as a personality. It belonged to a marine squamate radiation with its own history, its own anatomy, and its own set of experiments in feeding and locomotion. Smithsonian Magazine notes that mosasaurs diversified into a wide range of aquatic ambush predators, while Smithsonian Ocean points out that early mosasaurs were likely fish-eaters, and later forms evolved an explosion of dental variety suited to crushing, puncturing and slicing. That breadth within the group is another reason the label matters so much. Once you know what Mosasaurus really was, you stop flattening it into a generic sea monster and start seeing it as one branch of a very successful marine reptile family that spread across the late Cretaceous world. The title gets narrower, but the picture gets larger, so the cleanest answer is also the most useful one. Mosasaurus was a genus of giant marine squamates within the family Mosasauridae. It was not a dinosaur, though it lived alongside dinosaurs on land. It was not a whale, though some of its body solutions converged on whale-like efficiency, because the sea rewards certain designs no matter who arrives there. It came from lizard-related ancestors that moved from land toward water, and by the time of the classic giant forms it had become a fully aquatic predator, likely live-bearing, widespread, and specialised enough that even experts still debate exactly where it sits, relative to modern squamate branches. That is what it really was. Not a mislabelled celebrity from somebody else's family tree, but a marine reptile on its own terms, with its own lineage, its own rules, and its own way of turning an old lizard inheritance into something fit for dangerous water. And once that is clear, the next question becomes much more interesting, because now we can stop asking what box to put it in and start looking at the box it broke out of. The body itself, from snout to tail, tells that part of the story. Once you stop trying to fit Mosasaurus into the wrong family, the body begins to make much more sense. It stops looking like a dinosaur that wandered into the water, and it stops looking like a whale wearing a reptile costume. What you see instead is a marine squamate that had been reworked, part by part, into something fit for pursuit, interception, and violent feeding in a three-dimensional environment. That distinction matters because predators do not live by reputation. They live by anatomy. In water especially, every major feature has to earn its place. If the body creates too much drag, hunting becomes expensive. If the tail cannot produce enough thrust, the prey escapes. If the limbs are doing the wrong job, a turn comes too slowly. And if the skull cannot hold, grip, and process struggling prey, the rest of the design has done all its work for nothing. Mosasaurus belongs to a larger mosasaur story, in which those problems were solved increasingly well over time, and by the later, more derived forms, many of the solutions had become impressively refined. For a long time, mosasaurs were often pictured as rather simple sea lizards, long-bodied, eel-like swimmers pushing themselves forward by waving most of the body from side to side. That view was not entirely unreasonable when paleontologists had mainly skeletons and only scraps of soft tissue to work with. But better fossils have changed the picture. The Natural History Museum notes that the famous film version of Mosasaurus swims too much like an eel, and that more evolved species such as Mosasaurus probably move differently, with evidence from a preserved tail in a close relative suggesting a tail fluke with a large downward-pointing fin. A major PLOS-1 study on the exceptionally preserved mosasaur plate carpus likewise concluded that a streamlined body plan and crescent-shaped caudal fin were already well established in derived mosasaurs, expanding our understanding of how specialised these reptiles had become in the water. In other words, the old image of a giant scaly noodle with teeth is no longer good enough. The real animal was more organised than that, more efficient than that, and in some ways more intimidating because the body was not merely large, it was engineered. The tail sits at the centre of that engineering. One of the clearest signs that mosasaurs were serious swimmers comes from studies of their caudal anatomy and preserved soft tissues. The paleobiology paper on mosasaur in swimming describes an evolutionary pattern leading toward a high aspect ratio tail fin, broadly comparable in function to that of sharks, though built differently. It states that derived mosasaurs developed a hypercircle tail with a ventrocaudal bend, along with reduced intervertebral mobility and increased tail depth, marking a shift toward more optimized marine locomotion. Nature Communications later provided direct soft tissue evidence from a derived mosasaur showing a bilobed tail fin and concluded that such animals were propelled by hypercircle tail fins, with ecomorphological comparisons suggesting swimming performance similar to pelagic sharks. That is a remarkable sentence to be able to say about a lizard lineage, not because it makes mosasaurs into sharks, which they were not, but because it tells you how far the transformation had gone. The tail was no casual afterthought hanging off the back of an oversized reptile. It was the engine room. That change in the tail also changed how the rest of the body behaved. In more primitive side-to-side swimmers, a large portion of the body contributes to propulsion. In more efficient carangiform swimmers, much of the front section stays relatively controlled, while thrust is concentrated farther back. The same paleobiology study describes a transition in mosasaurian locomotion from anguilliform or sub-carangiform movement toward carangiform locomotion, tied to the increasing specialization of the tail and rear body. A separate PLOS-1 paper on preserved integument in Ectenosaurus found dermal structures and fibre arrangements that suggest the anterior torso was held somewhat rigid during swimming, limiting the major propulsive movements to the posterior body and tail. Put those ideas together and the picture sharpens nicely. Mosasaurus and its derived relatives were not trying to shove their entire length through the water in a constant wriggle. They were reducing wasted motion, stabilizing the front and letting the rear section and tail do the serious pushing. That is what good marine design tends to do. It does not announce itself loudly. It quietly removes inefficiency. The skin, surprisingly enough, matters almost as much as the skeleton. We tend to think of fossil reptiles in terms of bone because bone is what survives so often, but soft tissue evidence has been especially revealing in mosasaurs. The Ectenosaurus integument paper describes small ovoid scales with a central keel, arranged in overlapping patterns, supported by internal ridges and complex fibre bundles in the dermis. The authors argue that these features may have minimized surface deformation and frictional drag during locomotion, while also stiffening the lateral plane of the body. The Natural History Museum adds that snake-like scales in a relative of Mosasaurus would have made the body more streamlined, helping mosasaurs cut through the water more easily. That is one of those details that sounds modest until you sit with it for a moment. A large predator does not need to be perfect at everything. It only needs to be slightly better than the prey at the point of contact. A little less drag, a little more stiffness, a little more control in the front of the body, and suddenly the attack closes with fewer wasted movements. The scales were not decorative armour. They were part of the hydrodynamic package. The limbs tell a similar story. Britannica notes that mosasaurs had limbs modified into paddles, with shorter limb bones and more numerous finger and toe bones than those of their ancestors. That is the kind of change you make when feet no longer need to bear body weight on land, and can instead become broad control surfaces in water. The same source notes a backbone of more than 100 vertebrae in a long tail region, while the National Park Service explains that in some mosasaurs the tail made up more than half of the body length. This is important because it helps separate the jobs of the different body regions. The paddles were not the main propulsive organs in the way a sea turtle's flippers are. They were more likely used for steering, trimming, stabilizing, and fine control during turns or approach. The main driving force came from the rear body and tail. That arrangement is exactly what you would want in a predator that needed both burst movement and directional authority. Pure speed is useful, certainly, but useless if the prey slips sideways at the last second and the hunter cannot adjust. A body built to hunt needs power, but it also needs correction. The overall shape of the torso reinforces that same point. A 2010 PLOS-1 study on Platecarpus reported evidence for a streamlined body plan and noted anatomical details such as a downturned tail and probable visceral traces that illuminate the acquisition of a more fusiform body profile. A later study on Platecarpus osteology concluded that anterior migration of the rib cage and increased regionalization within the dorsal vertebral series were key features contributing to a streamlined body shape in hydropedal mosasaurs, and a related summary notes similar implications for Mosasaurus missouriensis. This sounds technical, because it is, but the basic idea is simple enough. The body did not stay evenly lizard-like from neck to hips. Different regions became more specialized, and the torso was shaped in a way that reduced resistance while preserving room for the organs and muscle needed by a large active hunter. Good streamlining is always a compromise between shape and function. If you make an animal too thin, you lose internal space and muscle distribution. If you make it too bulky, you pay for it in drag. Mosasaurs appear to have been moving toward that effective middle ground. Then there is the head, which is where the tone of the whole animal changes from efficient swimmer to serious predator. Britannica describes mosasaurs as having a large skull and long snout, with many conical, slightly recurved teeth set in individual sockets. It also notes that the lower jaws were jointed near mid-length and connected in front by ligaments only, allowing the jaws not merely to open downward, but also to extend sideways while feeding on large prey. The Natural History Museum adds that pterygoid teeth on the roof of the mouth are a characteristic feature in Mosasaurus and would have helped it grab prey, much as similar arrangements do in snakes today. This does not mean Mosasaurus unhinged its jaws in exactly the cartoonish way people sometimes imagine snakes doing, but it does mean the skull was built for prey handling as much as prey capture. A struggling animal in water creates chaos very quickly. Grip matters. Retention matters. The mouth was not just for making a first impression, it was for making sure the first impression became the last one. All of that makes the word ambush worth unpacking carefully. In popular narration, ambush predator can sometimes sound like a polite way of saying an animal could not really swim very well, and mostly lurked until something foolish drifted by. That is not what the evidence suggests for derived mosasaurs. Smithsonian Ocean notes that some lizards, including mosasaurs, appear to have maintained elevated body temperatures relative to the surrounding sea, though still influenced by water temperature, in a way somewhat comparable to certain sharks. The same source says such physiology may have helped meet the demands of being powerful predators, travelling long distances or producing quick bursts of speed. Combined with the tail and body evidence, that points toward an animal capable of more than a single clumsy lunge from the gloom. Mosasaurus was likely well suited to controlled cruising, sudden acceleration, and forceful interception. Ambush, then, should not be pictured as laziness. It should be pictured as efficiency. It means not wasting effort until effort will pay. It means reading distance correctly, using the watertight approach, and then converting stored motion into a very short and very decisive problem for something else. There is also strength in the sheer construction of the body, not only in its streamlining. Large mosasaurs were long animals with extensive vertebral columns, heavy skulls, substantial jaw musculature, and tails loaded with the muscle mass needed for propulsion. Britannica's summary of more than 100 vertebrae is not a trivial measurement detail. It tells you this was an elongated framework with many regions contributing to flexibility, support, and muscle attachment. The same source notes that the body was snake-like overall, but that phrase is best understood as describing length and general outline rather than softness or delicacy. Long animals can be very powerful when their length is organised properly. Think less loose rope and more segmented lever. In water, a well-muscled, long-bodied predator can use that length to turn, to strike through an arc, and to deliver mass into the bite. There is a reason so many successful aquatic hunters, from crocodilians to large sharks to marine mammals, solve their problems through the coordinated use of body length and tail power. Mosasaurus did the same with reptilian materials. It did not have to become a whale to understand the assignment. One of the more striking things about mosasaur evolution is how quickly the line seems to have become good at this job. The Pilus one-plate carpus study argues that advanced aquatic adaptations, including flipper-shaped limbs, a streamlined body, and a demarcated caudal fin functioning as an oscillating foil, likely originated within less than 10 million years after divergence from their terrestrial sister clade. That is a short span in geological terms for such a large reworking of body design. It means the sea was not merely tolerated by these reptiles. It was a powerful selective environment that rewarded useful changes rapidly. If a tail shape improved thrust, it spread. If a more rigid front body reduced waste, it spread. If flipper-like limbs improved control, they spread. This matters because it reminds us that the finished animal was not random. Every major feature had been tested again and again by prey that escaped, by turns that failed, by energy cost that added up, and by individuals that either caught enough food or did not. Evolution is not sentimental about body plans. If a predator keeps the same feature for long enough, it is usually because the feature pays rent. Even so, it would be a mistake to imagine Mosasaurus as a perfect universal swimmer that outperformed every marine animal in every possible task. Different predators are tuned for different combinations of acceleration, endurance, maneuverability, prey size, and feeding style. The Nature Communications tail fluke paper compares derived mosasaurs to pelagic sharks in swimming performance, while the paleobiology study describes a progression from nearshore dwellers to more pelagic cruisers across the mosasaur lineage. That language is useful because it preserves variety. Some mosasaurs were more specialized than others. Some likely cruised farther offshore. Some may have relied more heavily on ambush near productive habitats. Mosasaurus, as a derived and large-bodied form, seems to sit well toward the efficient marine end of the story, but even then its body had to balance swimming performance with the demands of carrying a massive skull and handling large prey. That balance may be one reason the animal remained so fascinating. It was not built to win a race for sport. It was built to close distance, overpower resistance, and eat things that would have been more than enough trouble for most other hunters. When you add those pieces together, the outline of the animal becomes much clearer. A relatively controlled front body, a powerful tail-driven rear section, paddles for steering and stability, skin arranged to reduce drag, a streamlined torso, a long body with abundant vertebrae, and a skull designed not merely to bite but to keep hold. That is not the anatomy of a drifting brute that happened to get very large. It is the anatomy of a predator with a specific operating method. It could approach quietly, correct its line, accelerate with the tail, seize with recurved teeth, and use skull mobility to manage prey that did not wish to cooperate. The power, in other words, was not only in the size, it was in the coordination of parts. Large predators are impressive. Integrated predators are effective. Mosasaurus was both, which is why it has lasted in the imagination so stubbornly. People sense, even before they know the details, that the animal was not just oversized, it was solved, and once you see the body that way, the next part of the picture almost arrives on its own, because a streamlined torso and a powerful tail only bring the hunter into position. After that, the work passes forward to the head, the jaws, and the teeth, where design stops being about approach and turns into the much more immediate question of what exactly happened when Mosasaurus finally got hold of something. When a body like that closes the distance, the next question is not whether Mosasaurus looked frightening. Plenty of animals look frightening in a drawing. The real question is what happened in the instant after contact, when the snout reached prey, the jaws opened, and all that streamlined motion had to turn into a secure hold. This is the point where Mosasaurus stops being a silhouette and becomes a machine. A marine predator does not get much credit for a missed first bite. Water slows sudden movements, prey slips, blood clouds the view, and anything worth catching usually comes with fins, shell, muscle, or teeth of its own. So the mouth of Mosasaurus had to do several jobs at once. It had to seize, it had to keep hold, it had to resist the strain of struggling prey, and once the prey was under control, it had to move that food inward without losing it back to the sea. That is what makes the jaws so interesting. They were not only large, they were practical. It also helps to be careful here, because with extinct animals there is always a line between what we know directly and what we infer from close relatives. We do not have a filmed feeding sequence of Mosasaurus, thankfully for the camera crew. What we do have are skulls, jaws, teeth, tooth attachment tissues in mosasaurs more broadly, bite marks on prey, stomach contents, and comparisons across the mosasaur family. Those lines of evidence fit together rather well. They tell us that mosasaurs were carnivores, that many had feeding equipment suited to taking substantial prey, and that large forms such as Mosasaurus belong to a mega-predatory end of the family's range. So when we talk about how Mosasaurus could crush, tear, and swallow, some parts of that picture come straight from the genus itself, while others are strengthened by what we know about closely related mosasaurs built on similar lines. That is not a weakness in the argument. It is simply how paleontology works when the animal has had 66 million years to avoid being interviewed. Start with the teeth, because they tell you very quickly that Mosasaurus was not built to nibble, gnaw, or do anything else gentle. The Natural History Museum notes that Mosasaurus had curved teeth with sharp points, and that most mosasaurs had curved and pointed teeth suited to grabbing prey such as fish, squid, and sharks. It also notes something very important about the roots. Unlike most squamates, mosasaurs evolved teeth with roots that sat in sockets, which helped them deliver forceful bites without damaging their own dentition. That sounds technical, but it matters. A tooth that is deeply anchored can tolerate heavy loading better than one that is not. If the mouth is expected to slam shut on hard, slippery, struggling animals, then strong attachment is not a luxury. It is basic equipment. Mosasaurus didn't carry flimsy little hooks that happened to look dangerous in profile. It carried serious working teeth, mounted for force, and set in jaws that expected resistance. The shape of those teeth also tells you what kind of force the animal preferred to use. Curved, pointed, slightly backward-facing teeth are excellent for puncturing and holding. They are less like kitchen knives and more like rows of barbed pegs. Once they enter flesh, escape becomes difficult because pulling backward often only seats them more securely. That is especially useful in water, where prey can twist, roll, and kick free in several directions at once. A fish can surge forward, a turtle can thrash, another reptile can torque its body violently. If the predator's teeth are straight and simple, the prey has a better chance of slipping off. If the teeth are recurved, every struggle becomes more dangerous for the prey and more useful for the hunter. Smithsonian Ocean points out that the earliest mosasaurs mostly had conical fish-catching teeth, and later mosasaurs diversified into forms with teeth that could crush, puncture, and slice. Mosasaurus sat in that larger radiation of effective marine carnivores, and its own pointed dentition fits the business of gripping large prey very well. That is why it would be slightly misleading to picture Mosasaurus as a bone-crushing reptilian equivalent of a mammal with massive molars. Some mosasaurs, such as globidans, really did evolve more specialized crushing teeth for hard-shelled prey. The Natural History Museum and Smithsonian Ocean both note that globidans had rounded teeth associated with cracking ammonites and shellfish, while xenodens evolved saw-like teeth for cutting. Mosasaurs, in other words, experimented across a wide feeding range. Mosasaurus itself, with its pointed recurved teeth, seems better suited to forceful capture and flesh handling than to the kind of repeated shell-grinding specialization seen in those more durophagous forms. So when we use the word crush for Mosasaurus, it is best understood in the broad predatory sense. It could overpower, compress, and break down prey through a strong bite and repeated handling, but it was not shaped like a dedicated shell crusher. The distinction matters because the real animal is more precise than the dramatic headline. Then there is the lower jaw itself, and here mosasaurs become genuinely strange in a very useful way. The Natural History Museum explains that the lower mosasaur jaw had a joint about halfway along its length that allowed it to hinge, which meant these reptiles could eat much larger prey than you might expect. An older Royal Society summary, surfaced in search results for a classic study, likewise notes that in mosasaurs prey was swallowed whole, and that large food items could be ingested because the jaw joints were able to spread laterally. This does not mean the jaw fell apart like a faulty folding chair. It means the two halves and associated elements had a degree of independent movement that gave the mouth more flexibility during prey handling. In practice, that would have mattered enormously. A wide, rigid bite is useful for a clean snap at modest prey. A more mobile jaw system is useful when what you have caught is too broad, too slippery, or too unwilling to slide neatly in on the first try. The roof of the mouth adds another layer to this. The Natural History Museum notes that Mosasaurus had pterygoid teeth on the roof of its mouth, much like snakes do today, and that these would have helped it grip prey. This is one of the least glamorous and most important details in the entire skull. Most people think of prey capture as something done by the obvious edge of the mouth, the teeth you can see when the jaw opens. But in animals that swallow large struggling prey, internal grip matters too. If the outer teeth catch the prey and the inner palatal teeth help hold and guide it, then the whole skull becomes more than a trap. It becomes a conveyor system. Not a neat mechanical conveyor, of course. More a noisy, muscular, underwater version of one, which is worse for everyone involved except the predator. But the principle is sound. Prey does not just need to be bitten. It needs to be prevented from backing out while the rest of the skull and throat do their work. This is where people often start saying that Mosasaurus could unhinge its jaw like a snake, and that phrase is both useful and annoying. Useful because it tells ordinary listeners that the mouth was more flexible than a crocodile's. Annoying because it suggests some theatrical skull trick that happened outside the limits of normal anatomy. What seems more likely is something more practical and therefore more impressive. The mosasaur skull combined powerful external teeth, internal pterygoid teeth, and a jaw system with enough mobility to handle prey larger than a simple rigid bite would allow. The result was not a magic trick. It was an effective feeding apparatus for large, slippery food. Search results from classic work on mosasaur jaws describe these features as adaptations for swallowing large and slippery prey, specifically fish, and later museum summaries extend the same logic to larger prey items, including marine reptiles. So the image to keep in mind is not a cartoon mouth detaching in all directions. It is a predator making small but crucial adjustments until the prey keeps moving inward and stops moving out. That swallowing process matters because Mosasaurus was not chewing in the mammalian sense. It was not reducing food into tidy mouthfuls with elaborate side-to-side grinding. A predator like this likely relied on seizing, holding, repositioning, and then either swallowing prey whole or tearing it into portions large enough to manage. The old Royal Society summary for Mosasaurus feeding states plainly that in mosasaurs the prey was swallowed whole, and the Natural History Museum points out that jaw flexibility let them take surprisingly large prey. That tells us a great deal about feeding style. The priority was not delicate oral processing. The priority was getting the prey under control and getting it down. In water, that is sensible. Small loose pieces are inefficient. A predator benefits from retaining a single secure mass of food, rather than turning a catch into a cloud of scraps that may drift away or attract competitors. The cleanest meal, from the hunter's point of view, is often the one that vanishes inward with the least discussion. Tearing, then, was probably less about knife-like slicing, and more about leverage, grip, and body motion. The teeth of Mosasaurus were pointed rather than blade-serrated in the way of some specialised cutting teeth, so it likely did not shear flesh exactly as a shark with strongly serrated teeth might. But a pointed recurved tooth does not need to act like a steak knife to do serious damage. If the jaws clamp down and the head jerks, twists or pulls back, those teeth can rip tissue, open wounds and remove chunks by force. This kind of feeding is common in predators that rely on retention first and cutting second. Smithsonian Ocean's overview of mosasaur teeth makes clear that different mosasaurs evolved different feeding tools, from crushing to slicing, while Mosasaurus retained the general predatory toolkit suited to large prey seizure. In that context, tearing would have been a consequence of power and motion rather than of delicate blade work. Crude? Yes. Effective, certainly. Elegance is overrated when you're on the receiving end. The skull as a whole also points toward a hunter comfortable with substantial prey. A 2023 paleobiology study on mosasaurid and early cetacean cranial evolution describes mega-predatory mosasaurids such as Mosasaurus and Tylosaurus as part of a convergent ecomorphological space associated with robust, large-skulled predators. The same paper emphasizes that mosasaurids radiated into a wide range of craniodental forms and niches, with mega-predatory morphologies among them. This is useful because it moves us away from the old simple idea that all mosasaurs were basically the same animal at different sizes. They were not. Some were better adapted to certain prey than others. Mosasaurus sits among the more serious heavy hitters, and its skull belongs in that company for a reason. Large temporal regions, strong jaw musculature, robust dentition, and prey-handling adaptations all fit the profile of an animal that did not live on small easy meals. It was equipped for the kind of feeding that puts a predator high up in the food web and keeps neighbouring animals attentive to sudden changes in the water. We even have direct evidence that mosasaurs could take large vertebrate prey. The Natural History Museum states that some well-preserved mosasaur fossils preserve stomach contents showing they were capable of eating other marine reptiles, including plesiosaurs and other mosasaurs. Smithsonian Magazine similarly notes that larger mosasaurs took prey such as sharks and other marine reptiles, and describes them as apex marine predators. That evidence does not mean every meal was dramatic, any more than every modern crocodile meal is a wildebeest. Predators eat what is practical. Still, it tells us the upper limit of what the feeding apparatus could handle. A mouth that can secure, process and swallow another marine reptile is not operating on the level of modest fish snacks and the occasional unfortunate squid. It is working at a scale where prey can fight back hard enough to matter. Once that is true, the whole skull has to be judged accordingly. These were not oversized lizard jaws making do. They were top predator jaws built to finish difficult work. There is an especially interesting piece of evidence in the long discussion over Ammonites. Smithsonian Ocean notes that some mosasaurs evolved crushing teeth, and a 2016 paper in Acta Geologica Polonica reviews evidence for mosasauroid predation on Ammonites, including distinctive bite traces interpreted in some cases as genuine attacks. The authors also summarise the debate, because not every mark on an Ammonite shell turns out to be the work of a reptile. Some supposed bite marks have been argued to be limpet scars instead. That uncertainty is worth keeping because it prevents the story from turning into overconfident storytelling. But the broader point still stands. Mosasaurs were capable predators in shell-rich environments. Some mosasaurs clearly specialised in hard prey, and at least part of the Ammonite damage record is consistent with mosasauroid attacks. That means the family as a whole explored a feeding spectrum from grabbing soft-bodied or fleshy prey to attacking armoured or shelled targets. Mosasaurus itself seems more at home on the raptorial large prey end of that spectrum, but it lived in a family that took the entire marine pantry very seriously indeed. Another detail people often miss is that swallowing in a marine predator is not just about mouth width. It is about timing, orientation, and control. Catch a large fish or reptile at the wrong angle, and all your excellent teeth have merely created a loud problem. The prey has to be turned or repositioned into a direction that the throat can manage. That is where the combination of external teeth, palatal teeth, and flexible jaw architecture becomes so valuable. Instead of needing a single perfect bite, Mosasaurus could likely secure prey and then work it inward in stages. The Natural History Museum's emphasis on the hinge in the lower jaw and the pterygoid teeth makes exactly this sort of handling behaviour plausible. It is one reason the feeding system feels so modern in a functional sense, even though the animal itself is extinct. The basic problem is eternal. Once you have something large and slippery in your mouth, how do you keep moving it only one way? Nature keeps solving that problem with variations on grip, leverage, and patience. Mosasaurus seems to have been very well supplied with all three. It is also likely that the final moments of a kill were messier and more repetitive than the clean dramatic snap people often picture. Large prey does not simply accept its fate because the soundtrack swells. There would have been repeated bites, corrections, surges of the head, perhaps body-assisted pulling, and the practical business of waiting for resistance to weaken before committing to a swallow. That is one reason the idea of Mosasaurus as a swallowing specialist is not at odds with its role as a tearing predator. These are not mutually exclusive behaviours. A large animal can grab one prey item and swallow it mostly whole, while another catch may need to be ripped, battered, or repositioned several times first. The anatomy does not lock the predator into one theatrical move. It gives the predator options, and options are what make apex hunters effective. A shark cannot solve every meal in the same way, neither can a crocodile. Mosasaurus would have been no different. Uniform methods are for machines in factories, not reptiles in open water. All of this also helps explain why Mosasaurus has held on so stubbornly in public imagination. The jaws were not terrifying simply because they were large. Plenty of extinct animals were large. These jaws are memorable because every part of them points in the same direction. The teeth say hold fast, the sockets say withstand force, the lower jaw says make room, the palate says do not let go. The skull says this prey may be difficult, but that is not a disqualifying feature. Once you see that, the old slogan about a predator that could swallow sharks stops sounding like cheap exaggeration and starts sounding like a rough public translation of a real anatomical truth. This was a marine reptile built to take substantial prey seriously. It did not need theatrical additions. The equipment was already there, and if anything, the real version is colder and more convincing than the movie one, because it is full of small practical solutions rather than one giant impossible trick. Once the jaws are understood that way, the next part almost sorts itself out, because a mouth like this tells you less about what the animal looked like than about what it was willing and able to eat, and the fossil record, inconveniently for anything else sharing that sea, suggests the menu was not especially narrow. To understand what Mosasaurus ate, it helps to remember that paleontologists do not get to watch the animal hunt. They have to build the menu from clues, and some clues are much stronger than others. The strongest kind is the most obvious one: actual stomach contents preserved inside the body. That is direct evidence, the fossil equivalent of catching a predator before it has had time to tidy up after dinner. A 2025 multi-proxy study on bear paw formation mosasaurs puts it plainly, noting that some mosasaurs preserve stomach contents that provide direct and unambiguous evidence of diet. Other kinds of evidence are a little more indirect but still useful, including the shape of the teeth, microscopic wear on those teeth, bite marks left on prey, and chemical signatures in an enamel that can hint at where and how an animal foraged. What makes Mosasaurus especially interesting is that when these lines of evidence are put together, the picture that emerges is not of a narrow specialist surviving on one favourite snack, but of a large predator with a broad and flexible menu. The basic starting point is simple enough. All mosasaurs are understood to have been carnivores. The Natural History Museum notes that mosasaur teeth evolved roots sitting in sockets, allowing forceful bites, and that most mosasaurs had curved, pointed teeth suited to grabbing prey such as fish, squid, and sharks. Smithsonian Ocean says something similar, explaining that the earliest mosasaurs were most likely fish eaters, and that their conical teeth were efficient at snagging fish, though later mosasaurs evolved a much wider variety of tooth designs capable of crushing, puncturing, and slicing. That last detail matters, because it reminds us not to treat all mosasaurs as though they were interchangeable. Some specialised in harder prey, some lean towards softer prey, some appear to have become broader generalists. Mosasaurus belonged to a family that had already diversified into many feeding roles by the late Cretaceous, which means its own diet has to be understood in that larger context of experimentation and ecological partitioning. For Mosasaurus itself, one of the most valuable direct clues comes from a specimen of Mosasaurus missouriensis. The Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology abstract, surfaced through the search results, describes this specimen as providing the first stomach contents known for the genus, and the abstract summary notes that the preserved fish skull was punctured and its vertebrae truncated, suggesting that Missouriensis was practicing macrophagy, meaning it could take relatively large prey rather than merely nibbling at small items. A more recent bear paw formation feeding study then summarises that same evidence by placing M. Missouriensis in the cut guild based on its recurved teeth, lack of major horizontal wear facets, and, most compellingly, gut contents that were mostly fish-based, along with squid. That is a very useful combination of evidence. It tells us not only that Mosasaurus could eat fish, which would not have been a shocking revelation in a Cretaceous sea, but that at least one species in the genus could take fairly substantial fish and process them with a feeding style suited to softer-bodied prey rather than the hard-crushing style of some other mosasaurs. That alone would already make Mosasaurus a successful large marine predator, because fish were abundant, widespread, and available across many marine settings. But the menu does not stop there. The Natural History Museum notes that some well-preserved mosasaur fossils still contain stomach contents, showing that mosasaurs could eat other marine reptiles, and it specifically says we know they were able to eat plesiosaurs and other mosasaurs. Smithsonian Magazine likewise summarizes fossilized gut contents as showing that these apex marine reptiles consumed sharks, fish, plesiosaurs, and other mosasaurs. The museum source is being careful here by speaking at the level of mosasaurs broadly, not every named mosasaurus specimen individually, and that caution is worth preserving. Still, Mosasaurus was one of the large derived mosasaurians with the skull and dentition, expected of a predator operating high in the food web, so this wider evidence matters to how we interpret the genus. It shows that animals built on this plan were not limited to one prey size or one prey type. They could move up the menu when opportunity and anatomy allowed. This is where paleontology becomes pleasantly forensic. A fossil gut content is the cleanest kind of dietary evidence, but it is also rare. Most individuals do not fossilize with their final meal still in place, and even when something is preserved inside the rib cage, researchers still have to rule out the possibility that the bones drifted in later. That is why position matters so much. National Geographic's report on the Mosasaurus missouriensis specimen emphasised that the fish bones had not washed in after death, and that their arrangement, along with bite marks on some of the bones, indicated they represented the mosasaur's last meal. The value of that kind of evidence is enormous. It bypasses a lot of guesswork. Tooth shape can tell you what an animal could probably do. Gut contents tell you what it actually did at least once. And when the direct evidence lines up with the expected function of the skull and teeth, confidence grows that the reconstruction is on the right track. Still, paleontologists cannot build a full menu from one stomach alone, so they turn to other clues. Tooth form is one of the oldest and most useful. The Natural History Museum states that the exact shape of mosasaur teeth varied depending on prey, with curved pointed teeth helping grab fish, squid and sharks, while globidens had teeth suited to gripping and cracking ammonites, and xenodens had saw-like teeth that might have carved flesh. Smithsonian Ocean says that by about 80 million years ago, mosasaurs underwent an explosion of evolution and quickly developed teeth that could crush, puncture and slice. These sources reinforce the same general principle. Teeth are not random decorations. They are feeding tools, and different tools imply different prey handling strategies. In Mosasaurus, the recurved, pointed teeth suggest a hunter comfortable with seizing and retaining vertebrate prey, especially animals that were slippery, muscular and difficult to subdue cleanly in water. That is why fish and squid fit so well. So do sharks, at least smaller or manageable ones. So do marine reptiles, if the predator was large enough and the opportunity right. Microscopic wear on the teeth adds another layer. Dental microwear does not show the animal's last meal. Instead, it captures repeated behaviour over time by recording tiny scratches, pits and textures that build up through feeding. A 2023 scientific report study applied three-dimensional dental microwear texture analysis to type Maastrichtian mosasaurs from the Netherlands and Belgium, and found that these mosasaurs did not exhibit neatly defined diets or strict dietary partitioning. Instead, the authors identified three broad dietary groupings, with Mosasaurus hoffmanni spanning a larger plot area than the other taxa studied. In the context of the paper, that broader spread suggests a wider dietary range or at least a more flexible feeding niche. The same paper emphasises that many older dietary interpretations rested on more qualitative evidence, and that microwear offers a more testable way to constrain diet. That is especially helpful for Mosasaurus. because it pushes against the overly tidy idea that it lived on one preferred prey category and nothing else. The more honest picture is broader. Mosasaurus looks less like a picky specialist and more like a large animal capable of taking different foods depending on availability and circumstance. A 2025 bear paw formation study points in much the same direction. It says that Mosasaurus seems to be an all-rounder, overlapping with almost all the other studied groups, and it notes that Mimosaurensis showed both fine scratches and pits on its teeth, consistent with using them on both softer and harder food items. That is a very important nuance. It does not mean Mosasaurus was a shell crusher on the level of a specialised durophage such as globidans. It means the animal's feeding behaviour was not limited to one texture or one prey structure. It could handle softer-bodied prey such as fish and squid, but its teeth were also being used on tougher or more resistant food, often enough to leave a broader wear signal. That fits extremely well with a large generalist predator in a competitive sea. Specialists can do one thing brilliantly. Large apex hunters often need to do several things well enough. Chemical evidence contributes too, though it has to be interpreted carefully. Carbon isotope studies of mosasaur tooth enamel do not tell scientists the species name of the last fish swallowed. What they can do is offer clues about foraging habitat, depth, and broad resource partitioning. The 2013 Netherlands Journal of Geosciences paper on type Maastrichtian mosasaurs states that carbon isotope composition in tooth enamel is affected by diet and habitat partitioning, and its conclusions say that diving and dietary specialization were important determinants of the isotopic pattern preserved in mosasaur teeth. A later 2025 review expands on this, interpreting enamel carbon isotopes primarily as a proxy for foraging area, which may reflect shoreline proximity, water depth, or a combination of both. In script terms, that means isotopes help paleontologists understand not just what an animal ate, but where it was likely hunting for it. A predator feeding offshore on different prey from one cruising shallower waters may leave a different isotopic signature, even if both are broadly carnivorous. So isotopes do not hand as a menu card, but they do tell us which part of the restaurant the animal probably favoured. Then there are bite marks, which are wonderfully dramatic and maddeningly open to argument at the same time. Some of the most famous supposed evidence for mosasaur feeding comes from Ammonite shells with punctures or rows of holes. The University of Michigan Museum of Paleontology presents a specimen of Placenticerus with rows of holes interpreted as puncture marks from mosasaur teeth, arguing that such traces show ammonites were prey. The USGS also labels bite marks on a Placenticerus specimen as attributable to a mosasaur, but science, quite rightly, is not obliged to accept a dramatic story just because it looks good in a display case. A geology paper argued that some alleged mosasaur bite marks on late Cretaceous ammonites were actually limpet home scars altered after burial, and a review paper in Acta Paleontologica Polonica summarised that criticism. Then, a later paleogeography, paleoclimatology, paleoecology paper pushed back, defending the mosasaur bite interpretation for at least some perforated Placenticerus specimens. In other words, the ammonite evidence is real, important, and disputed. That is not a problem. It is actually a fine example of how paleontology works when the evidence is intriguing but incomplete. Some ammonite damage may well reflect mosasaur attacks. Some famous examples remain debated. The honest version of the story is a little less tidy and much more trustworthy. There are also newer traces that strengthen the broader case for mosasauroid attacks on shelled cephalopods. A 2024 Cretaceous research abstract describes bite traces on an ammonite with jaw margin suggesting an attack aimed at the apertural part, the area containing the head and arm crown, and says the damage supports a lethal bite. That does not prove that every classic punctured ammonite in a museum was bitten by a mosasaur, but it does reinforce the general plausibility of mosasauroid predation on such prey. So even here, in one of the messier corners of the menu, the overall signal remains consistent. Large marine reptiles of this group were capable of attacking cephalopods, and at least some shell damage in the fossil record appears to record exactly that sort of encounter. Another category on the menu is sharks, and here the evidence is suggestive enough that the later question about swallowing them begins to feel less like tabloid phrasing and more like a legitimate paleobiological problem. The Natural History Museum explicitly includes sharks among the prey inferred from the pointed teeth of many mosasaurs. A 2016 Science Direct abstract on a mosasaur from Antarctica says the diet of mosasaurs is partially known from intestinal contents and apparently comprised everything they could swallow, including fishes and sharks of all sizes, plesiosaurs, seabirds, likely sea turtles, smaller mosasaurs and probably floating carcasses of dinosaurs. That abstract is broad and refers to mosasaurs generally rather than Mosasaurus alone, but it aligns with the wider evidence of a group capable of taking other predators as prey. The ocean does not recognise the dramatic distinction humans sometimes make between hunter and not lunch. If a shark was small enough, vulnerable enough, or simply unlucky enough, it could end up in the wrong mouth. Birds and turtles also appear in the wider mosasaur dietary record. Smithsonian Magazine summarises fossilised gut contents as including seabirds, while the 2025 Bearpaw study contrasts Mosasaurus with Prognathodon overtoni, noting that the latter had turtle remains in its stomach and a toothwear pattern consistent with harder prey processing. This is useful, even though it is not direct evidence for turtle eating by every Mosasaurus species. It shows that within the same broad ecosystem, closely related giant marine reptiles were partitioning resources in different ways. One form leaned more heavily into softer prey such as fish and squid. Another processed harder prey, including turtles. That ecological variety helps explain how multiple large predators could coexist in the same sea without instantly starving one another out. It also helps keep us from turning Mosasaurus into a caricature that ate every living thing in identical fashion. It was powerful, yes, but it was also part of an ecosystem in which different mosasaurs could solve the hunting problem differently. What about cannibalism or intrafamilial predation? Here too the evidence is uncomfortable and fascinating. The Natural History Museum says we know mosasaurs could eat other mosasaurs, and a 2023 report on the gut region of Prognathodon cyander from Angola describes 3 partial mosasaurs in its stomach region, including what the authors interpret as the first documented occurrence of cannibalism in mosasaurs. That specimen is not Mosasaurus, but it reinforces a larger point. In these Cretaceous seas, being a mosasaur did not make one safe from other mosasaurs. Large marine predators often eat juveniles, smaller relatives, or any suitably sized competitor they can overpower. Once a lineage reaches that level of predatory flexibility, the menu stops being organised by our tidy categories and starts being organised by opportunity, size, and risk. It is a harsh rule, but a very old one. There is also an important difference between what an animal preferred and what it could eat if needed. This is where the broader microwear and isotope work helps temper the more dramatic direct evidence. A stomach content captures one or several recent meals, not necessarily the lifetime average. A bite mark captures one interaction, not the whole dietary budget. Microwear samples a broader stretch of feeding behaviour. Isotopes can hint at habitat and resource use over longer spans still. When those lines of evidence are combined, Mosasaurus begins to look like a large generalist carnivore that could take fish regularly, likely squid as well, and potentially a range of other prey depending on species, size, local ecosystem and opportunity. The 2023 Microwear study's conclusion that Monsieur Hoffmanni spans a wider dietary space fits that view very well, as does the 2025 characterisation of Bearpaw Mosasaurus as an all-rounder. This is a better and more realistic picture than imagining one fixed menu. In nature, a giant successful predator is rarely a fussy diner. So how do we know what this predator ate? We know it first from preserved gut contents, which give direct evidence of meals such as fish, squid, and, at the family level, even other marine reptiles. We know it from teeth, whose shapes reveal whether a mosasaur was better suited to grabbing, puncturing, crushing, or slicing. We know it from microscopic wear, which records repeated feeding behaviour over time and suggests that Mosasaurus was probably broader in diet than a single dramatic fossil meal might imply. We know it from isotopes, which help reconstruct foraging zones and resource partitioning, and we know it, with a bit more argument and caution, from damaged prey such as Ammonites that may preserve the marks of attack. None of these clues, taken alone, would give the whole story. Together they do something much better. They show a predator with options, a hunter that could take fish confidently, likely squid too, perhaps sharks and other vertebrates when conditions favoured it, and that belonged to a wider mosasaur radiation, in which diets range from shell crushing to flesh slicing to broad generalism. And that is what makes the next claim worth slowing down for, because once you accept that the menu could include fish, squid, sharks, and even other marine reptiles, the famous line about an ocean predator that could swallow sharks stops sounding like poster copy and starts sounding like a question that deserves a careful answer. Once you reach this question, it becomes very tempting to answer it the way movie trailers do. Yes, absolutely, next question. But the real answer is better than that, because it has shape to it. Could Mosasaurus swallow sharks? In some cases, very likely yes. In all cases, certainly not. And in the most dramatic version people usually imagine, a giant shark vanishing whole into a single impossible gulp, the fossil record becomes much more cautious. The truth depends on three things: which Mosasaurus species you mean, which shark you mean, and what you mean by swallow. The first thing to clear away is the wrong shark. People often hear shark and immediately picture megalodon, because megalodon has become the default giant shark in modern imagination. That comparison does not work. Megalodon lived more than 40 million years after Mosasaurus, so the two never met, and even upper estimates for Mosasaurus still leave Megalodon as the larger animal. The Natural History Museum says Megalodon lived more than 40 million years later, and gives it an estimated length of around 24.3 metres, while Britannica says the longest mosasaurs, based on a specimen of Mosasaurus hoffmanni, are estimated at about 17 metres. So if someone imagines Mosasaurus cruising around swallowing megalodons like oversized sardines, that belongs to fantasy, not paleontology. Once Megalodon is out of the room, the question becomes much more reasonable, because shark is not a single size category. Modern sharks range from very small species to giants, and Smithsonian Ocean notes that half of living shark species are less than 1 metre long. Even in the late Cretaceous, sharks came in a range of sizes. A study abstract on Squalicorax says S. falcatus typically measured about 1.8 to 2.0 metres and probably did not exceed 3 metres. So right away, the phrase, "could it swallow sharks?" stops sounding absurd. A giant marine predator does not need to swallow every shark to make the statement broadly plausible. It only needs to be capable of swallowing some sharks, and once you are dealing with sharks in the 1 to 3 metre range, that sounds much less like legend and much more like ecology. Then there is Mosasaurus itself, which was not one fixed standard size animal. The Natural History Museum says the 5 recognised species varied in size, with Mosasaurus hoffmanni thought to be the largest. It also notes that some scientists have suggested 17 or 18 metres for the biggest individuals, while others think 11 to 12 metres is more likely, and that species such as M. zurensis and M. bojae have been estimated around 8 to 10 metres. That range matters a great deal. A very large Emsus hoffmanni is a different swallowing proposition from a smaller Mosasaurus species, just as a large adult crocodile is a different proposition from a juvenile. So when people ask this question as though there were one universal Mosasaurus with one universal answer, the honest response is that size within the genus matters, and it changes the upper limit of what swallow can realistically mean. The jaws and skull make the possibility more plausible still. Britannica notes that mosasaurs had many conical, slightly recurved teeth set in sockets, and that the lower jaw bones were jointed near mid-length, and connected in front by ligaments only, an arrangement that allowed the lower jaws to extend sideways while feeding on large prey. The Natural History Museum adds that Mosasaurus had pterygoid teeth on the roof of the mouth and a hinge in the lower jaw that would have helped it eat prey larger than expected. These are not the features of an animal restricted to neat, bite-sized meals. They are the features of an animal built to secure large, slippery prey, keep it from escaping, and work it inward. So from a purely anatomical standpoint, the idea that Mosasaurus could swallow at least some sharks is not remotely outlandish. The skull was made for exactly the sort of difficult handling that sharks would require. Direct evidence from the genus itself is a little more restrained, which is where the story becomes more honest. The best-known stomach contents for Mosasaurus come from M. musculensis, and the evidence there points to fish and squid rather than a preserved shark meal. The 2025 Bear Paw Formation study says M. musculensis was placed firmly in the cut gill based on its recurved teeth, lack of exposed horizontal wear facets, and, most compellingly, mostly fish-based contents as well as squid in the gut. The earlier 2014 study summary says the fish skull in that specimen was punctured and its vertebrae truncated, suggesting macrophagy, meaning it was handling relatively large prey. That's important for two reasons. First, it shows Mosasaurus could take prey larger than a simple tidy bite. Second, it shows that for the genus itself, our clearest direct fossil meal is not shark swallowed whole, but a substantial prey item that appears to have been processed and consumed in pieces or large sections. That last point matters more than it might seem, because people often hear swallow and picture one clean gulp. The fossil evidence suggests a more flexible reality. The Mosasaurus stomach content specimen indicates that prey larger than the skull could be consumed, but not necessarily as one intact object. Search results summaries of the 2014 paper state that the prey fish was around 1 meter long, and that the fish skull was punctured while the vertebrae were truncated, implying dismemberment or partial processing. So the better question is not simply whether Mosasaurus could swallow a shark whole in one motion. It is whether Mosasaurus could take a shark, subdue it, and get it down by swallowing it whole if small enough, or by tearing and consuming manageable portions if larger. On that broader and more realistic definition, the case becomes much stronger. The wider mosasaur family pushes the answer further in that direction. The Natural History Museum says most mosasaur species had curved and pointed teeth that helped them grab fish, squid, and sharks. Smithsonian Ocean says fossilized meals from mosasaurs have included pieces of fish, squid, and octopus relatives, seabirds, turtles, plesiosaurs, and even other mosasaurs. A science paper on body temperature in some Mesozoic marine reptiles likewise summarizes stomach contents as showing highly diverse foods, including other marine reptiles. All of that means the family was not shy about ambitious prey. Mosasaurs as a group clearly took a wide range of vertebrate meals, and sharks were among the kinds of prey their dentition was suited to catching. So while direct Mosasaurus plus whole shark in belly evidence is limited, the broader ecological context says that a large mosasaur taking a shark is very much within bounds. Where the legend usually overshoots is scale. There were Cretaceous sharks that would not have been sensible one-gulp prey. Some were serious predators in their own right. The abstract for Cretoxyrhina mantelli from Italy estimates specimens at roughly 6.15 to 6.5 meters and describes the shark as a large pelagic lamniform with an ecology similar to the modern white shark. A shark of that size is not something even a very large Mosasaurus would casually vacuum up like soup. It might still be attacked, it might be torn apart, a juvenile or smaller individual might be swallowed in substantial sections. But the phrase "swallow sharks" becomes less convincing if we silently substitute the largest predatory sharks available. A 6-meter shark is a very different proposition from a 2-meter shark. Real predators care very much about that difference, even when movie posters do not. And there is another reason not to oversimplify it. Sharks bite back. Large Cretaceous marine ecosystems were full of top predators that overlapped in prey and occasionally in danger. Evidence exists for sharks feeding on mosasaurs too, whether by attack or scavenging. A Cambridge paper discussing sharks eating mosasaurs notes partially digested mosasaur vertebrae in shark material, and points out that at least some direct evidence shows sharks did attack living mosasaurs. That does not weaken Mosasaurus. It strengthens the realism of the ecosystem. These were not seas in which one crowned monster enjoyed universal immunity. A big Mosasaurus was dangerous. A big shark was dangerous. A smaller shark could certainly be prey. A larger shark could be competition, a threat, or a meal depending on age, size, circumstance, and luck. Ancient oceans were not organised by branding. So the real dividing line is prey size relative to skull size and feeding strategy. Britannica and the Natural History Museum both emphasise jaw mobility and the ability to handle large prey. But that does not guarantee a single uninterrupted swallow for every target. The 2025 Bearpaw study is especially helpful here because it says Mosasaurus seems to be an all-rounder, and the M. missouriensis shows we're consistent with using its teeth on both softer and harder food items. The same study also says Mahoffmani shows a generalist diet, and that Mosasaurus overlaps with almost all the other groups studied. That sounds exactly like what you would expect from a predator that did not rely on one rigid feeding method. Some prey could be swallowed whole. Some prey likely had to be gripped, repositioned, and swallowed in stages. Some prey may have been torn into large pieces. Could it swallow sharks, therefore has to be read as, could it incorporate sharks into its feeding repertoire? Not, did every shark vanish in one smooth gulp? There is also a nice practical point hidden in the direct evidence from Monsieur missouriensis. Even a smaller member of the genus was already capable of dealing with prey that was awkward relative to its own head. The fish in its gut was not a neat little snack size to the skull. The study summary says the prey skull was punctured and the vertebrae truncated, which strongly suggests active reduction of the meal rather than a tidy whole-body swallow. That makes the legend more believable in one way, and less theatrical in another. Yes, a Mosasaurus could very plausibly eat a shark. But no, that does not mean it had to behave like a cartoon vacuum cleaner. Real predators solve the problem in whichever way works. If a one-and-done swallow is efficient, they do that. If tearing is safer, they tear. If the prey is narrow enough to go down whole after some repositioning, down it goes. A shark is not a category with one answer. It is a set of bodies with different lengths, widths, and hazards. This is also where the phrase swallow sharks becomes a little unfair to sharks, because many sharks are not broad-bodied monsters. Some are relatively slim, especially compared with more heavily built prey. A long, narrow prey item is often easier to swallow than a shorter, deeper-bodied one of equal mass. Fish-eating predators understand this quite well, even if they do not write it down. So a moderate-sized shark may actually be more manageable than some other equally long prey, provided it can be subdued without disastrous injury. The teeth and jaw architecture of Mosasaurus, with recurved teeth, palate teeth, and jaw mobility, are all exactly the sort of equipment that would help with that kind of job. The challenge is not only size, it is control. And control is what the Mosasaurus skull appears to have been built for. The safest conclusion, then, is a layered one. A very large Mosasaurus could almost certainly swallow small sharks whole, and probably some medium-sized sharks as well, especially if they were relatively slender. For larger sharks, especially serious apex forms, a whole-body swallow becomes less convincing, while partial consumption, tearing, and stage swallowing become more likely. For the very largest sharks people love to imagine, such as Megalodon, the comparison collapses entirely because those animals did not coexist, and Megalodon was larger anyway. The legend is therefore not pure nonsense, but it does need translation. It could swallow sharks is believable if sharks means some sharks. It becomes doubtful if sharks means every shark. It becomes false if sharks means Megalodon. And perhaps that is the most satisfying answer of all, because the real animal does not need exaggeration. A marine lizard large enough to plausibly swallow certain sharks, capable of taking other large vertebrate prey, equipped with a skull built for grip and inward transport, and flexible enough in feeding style to be called an all-rounder, is already more than enough. The truth behind the legend is not that Mosasaurus was an impossible sea monster that could eat anything whatsoever. It is that it was a genuinely formidable predator whose limits were high enough to make the legend understandable. And once you admit that, the sea around it starts to feel more crowded again, because a hunter like that never lived alone in the imagination of its world. It lived among rivals, competitors, and other predators with appetites of their own. That starts to reveal something important about Mosasaurus. It was not moving through an empty ocean as the single unchallenged horror of its age. It was one of several large predators living in late Cretaceous seas, and the exact list of rivals changed depending on where and when you looked. In some places, its nearest competition came from other mosasaurs with different skulls and teeth. In others, sharks filled similar predatory space. In still others, plesiosaurs remained part of the upper marine food web. So when people imagine Mosasaurus as a lone ruler of the sea, the picture becomes a little too simple. The real setting was busier than that, and in some ways more interesting, because success in such a world did not come from size alone. It came from fitting into a crowded predatory system without being outcompeted, outmaneuvered, or turned into somebody else's unfortunate lunch. The rivalries were not always dramatic battles in the cinematic sense. More often they were quieter contests over prey, depth, habitat, feeding style, and opportunity. That is how ecosystems usually work, even when the participants happen to have very alarming skulls. One of the clearest places to see that is the Campanian Bearpaw Sea of Alberta, where researchers have described a mosasaur community that included Mosasaurus missouriensis, Prognathodon overtoni, Pleoplesicarpus primevus, a probable Tylosaurus identified as likely Tylosaurus pariga, and possibly Mosasaurus conodon. The 2025 Bearpaw Feeding Ecology study says outright that with 2 dominant taxa and several additional mosasaurs present, some form of habitat or dietary niche partitioning was to be expected. In other words, these animals were not all doing exactly the same job. They lived in the same broad marine system, but they appear to have reduced direct competition by leaning into different prey types and foraging patterns. That is a useful correction to the old big predator versus big predator way of imagining prehistoric seas. Predators can be rivals without fighting constantly. If one tends toward harder prey, another toward more generalist feeding, and a third toward faster or more elusive prey, they can all remain formidable while avoiding a permanent ecological traffic jam. Ancient oceans, like modern ones, rewarded that kind of separation. Within that bearpaw assemblage, the split between Mosasaurus and Prognathodon is especially instructive. The same 2025 study found a clear separation between the two, with Mosasaurus missouriensis showing more generalist dietary preferences, while Prognathodon overtoni showed a tendency toward harder prey and a possible macrophagus style, meaning it may have dealt more often with large prey that had to be heavily processed. The paper also notes that Mosasaurus missouriensis had mostly fish and squid in its gut, whereas one bearpaw Prognathodon overtoni specimen was found with turtle remains in its stomach and showed large horizontal wear facets on its dentition. That is a remarkably practical difference. These were not simply 2 giant reptilian mouths competing in identical fashion. One seems to have been more of an all-rounder, broad in what it could take. The other leaned harder into prey that demanded stronger teeth and more forceful processing. So if Mosasaurus had a heavyweight mosasaur rival in some waters, it was not always a mirror image of itself. Often, it was something built to solve the feeding problem differently, which may be exactly why both could persist in the same sea. The picture becomes even richer when you move to the type Maastrichtian of the Netherlands and Belgium, the region historically tied to Mosasaurus hoffmanni. There, researchers studying tooth enamel isotopes and dental microwear have worked with a fauna that includes 5 mosasaur taxa: Mosasaurus hoffmanni, Prognathodon saturator, Prognathodon sectorius, Pleopletycarpus marshi, and Carinodens belgicus. The isotope study found distinct partitioning in tooth enamel carbon values among the 5 taxa, with larger animals tending toward more negative values, while the 2023 microwear study concluded that the type Maastrichtian mosasaurs showed signs of dietary generalism overall, but with enough separation between species groups to suggest some degree of specialization and partitioning. That is exactly the sort of result you would expect in a sea supporting multiple predators of different sizes and skull designs. No one form had to be the universal solution to every meal. Mosasaurus could be broad and powerful. Prognathodon could lean toward a different prey texture space. Smaller taxa could carve out narrower roles. The result was not chaos, but a structured predatory community. Even among sea monsters, organisation helps. Prognathodon deserves a longer look because it seems to have been one of the most serious mosasaur rivals in latest Cretaceous seas, especially in places where tylosaurines were rare or absent. A short Netherlands Journal of Geosciences paper on Prognathodon cf. Saturator notes that the type Maastrichtian has 2 species of Prognathodon, P. saturator and P. sectorius, and that occurrences of P. saturator there are extremely rare, perhaps because this species preferred a more offshore habitat. The broader Moroccan Maastrichtian study adds another layer by showing that mosasaurines dominated those faunas, that niche partitioning probably permitted a high diversity of large marine predators, and that multiple species of Prognathodon occupied a distinctive crush-cut guild of apex predators. That combination is telling. It suggests that in some late Cretaceous seas, especially around the Tethyan margins, the main competition facing a large Mosasaurus was not necessarily from one giant shark or a leftover pliosaur from another era, but from other mosasaurines, especially Prognathodon species, occupying adjacent but not identical predatory roles. Mosasaurus was not alone at the top. It shared that space with other reptiles that were built to be taken very seriously. Then there is Pleopletycarpus, which looks less imposing at first glance than the giant mosasaurines, but becomes more interesting the longer you look at it. The Bearpaw study found that Pleopletycarpus primavus occupied a distinct position from the larger mosasaurs, and that its microwear suggested a mainly piscivorous signal, with some evidence of harder prey use as well. The same paper points to a specimen with very large orbits, which the authors cite as evidence for visual foraging at the deepest reaches of the photic zone, and it explicitly notes that such a lifestyle could have helped it chase agile prey, while also dodging larger predators such as Prognathodon and Mosasaurus. That is an excellent reminder that rivalry is not always symmetrical. A smaller predator in the same sea can be a competitor for some resources, prey for a larger hunter in other situations, and a specialist exploiting parts of the environment that bigger forms use less efficiently. Pleopletycarpus may not have been the animal that kept adult Mosasaurus awake at night, if marine reptiles worried about such things, but it was part of the same predatory field, and helps show how finely divided late Cretaceous marine ecosystems could become. Tylosaurus sits in a slightly different position, because it was a genuine rival in some times and places, but not a universal one throughout the latest Mosasaurus story. The Bearpaw study includes a probable Tylosaurus pariga in the northern western interior seaway community, and concludes that Tylosaurus there seems to have followed a diet similar to bearpaw elasmosaurs, or may even have preyed on them. It also notes that Tylosaurus from Saskatchewan and Tylosaurus proriger from the Niobrara of Kansas preserve stomach contents including small mosasaurs and elasmosaurs, which tells you immediately what kind of company this was. Tylosaurus was not a background extra. It was a large predator capable of taking serious vertebrate prey. At the same time, tylosaurines do not appear everywhere that Mosasaurus does. A separate Tylosaurine paper says the youngest record of Tylosaurus in North America is Middle Campanian, while in Europe it reaches into the early Maastrichtian, and the Moroccan Maastrichtian review notes that tylosaurines are presently unknown in those phosphates. So the answer is not Mosasaurus always faced Tylosaurus. It is that, depending on where you set the scene, Tylosaurus could be one of the major reptilian rivals in the water, but by the very latest Cretaceous in some regions, the cast had changed. Sharks complicate the picture further because they could be prey, competition, scavengers, and in at least some cases active attackers of mosasaurs themselves. The Netherlands isotope study explicitly compares mosasaur enamel with shark tooth enamel from the same lithological sequence, showing that researchers are not treating sharks as background decoration, but as part of the same broader ecological framework. The Moroccan phosphate study goes even further by noting that the lack of mosasaurids along one part of the tooth morphogill spectrum may indicate that those ecological niches were occupied by other marine vertebrates, such as Selacians and Plesiosaurians. That is an important point. Sharks were not merely things for mosasaurs to bite. In some prey niches and parts of the food web, they were filling roles that mosasaurs did not. The waters were not arranged as reptiles on top and fish beneath. They were arranged as overlapping guilds, some reptilian, some chondrichthyan, all feeding into the same productive sea. A big Mosasaurus could certainly eat some sharks. A sea full of sharks could still shape what was worth chasing, where, and at what risk. That is what makes them rivals in the ecological sense, even when one ends up inside the other. And the rivalry with sharks was not hypothetical in only one direction. A 2005 paper reviewing shark bite marks on mosasaur bones from Kansas and the Maastrichtian type area concluded that while some marks most likely represent scavenging, evidence of healing and the presence of a shark tooth in an infected abscess confirm that sharks also actively hunted living mosasaurs. That is one of the most useful facts in the whole discussion because it keeps the ecosystem honest. Mosasaurus was not invulnerable. Even a dominant marine reptile lived in water with other fast, heavily armed predators. A juvenile mosasaur, a weakened one, or simply an unlucky one could become part of a shark's feeding story. This does not dethrone Mosasaurus, and it does not make sharks the undisputed winners either. It simply tells us that the top of the late Cretaceous marine food web had several teeth sticking out of it at once. Apex systems are often untidy that way. There can be more than one dangerous thing in the same room, and sometimes they leave marks on each other. Plesiosaurs belong in the same conversation, though with a little care. By the latest Cretaceous, they were not necessarily as abundant or diverse everywhere as mosasaurs, but they had not vanished from the upper marine food web. The abstract of a 2013 Gondwana research paper on Moroccan fossils states that both mosasaurs and plesiosaurs were apex predators in latest Cretaceous seas, even though coval plesiosaur data from those deposits are comparatively scarce. The Natural History Museum's plesiosaur overview likewise notes that at least some plesiosaurs likely fed on large fish, and, given their size, other marine reptiles. That does not mean every Mosasaurus was locked in constant combat with plesiosaurs across all regions. It does mean these animals shared upper trophic space in some marine systems, and that they would have overlapped as large vertebrate hunters. Add to that the Natural History Museum's statement that mosasaurs could eat plesiosaurs, and the relationship starts to look rather flexible. In some encounters, a plesiosaur would be a competitor for prey. In others, it could become prey itself. Rivalry and predation are not opposites in ancient seas. Sometimes they are simply different outcomes of the same meeting. If you step back from the individual names for a moment, a pattern becomes clear. Late Cretaceous seas could support several large predatory lineages at once, because those lineages were not perfectly overlapping copies of one another. In bear paw, the 2025 study found distinct niche differentiation among Mosasaurus, Prognathodon, Pleoplatycarpus, and Tylosaurus. In the type Maastrichtian, isotope and microware work points to partitioning among 5 mosasaur taxa. In Morocco, the richness of the mosasaurid fauna and the author's use of tooth morphogills again argue for niche partitioning as the mechanism that allowed a high diversity of large marine predators to coexist. This is one of those cases where the science is quieter than the popular image, but also more revealing. The sea did not solve the problem of too many predators by staging endless battles to the death. It solved it through spacing. One form leans toward harder prey, another toward generalism, another toward smaller, fast prey, another toward offshore conditions, another toward prey types also pursued by sharks or plesiosaurs. Over time, that becomes an ecosystem rather than a duel. It is less theatrical perhaps, but much more believable. This also tells you something important about Mosasaurus itself. Its strength was not only that it was large, though of course it was. Its strength was that, in at least some well-studied settings, it appears to have been broad. The Bearpaw study calls Mosasaurus an all-rounder, overlapping with almost all the other groups, and the 2023 Microwear work on Mosasaurus hoffmanni also supports a generally broad feeding space. That matters in a sea full of rivals. A predator that can switch among prey types, habitats, or hunting opportunities has an advantage when the exact conditions change. If the heavily built prognathodon is better at one kind of meal, Mosasaurus can still do several others well. If smaller, more agile forms exploit certain prey more efficiently, Mosasaurus can move upward in prey size or outward in foraging style. Generalism does not sound glamorous at first, but in a crowded predatory world it can be a very strong position. Specialists shine brightest when their preferred niche stays reliable. A large adaptable hunter can remain dangerous under a wider range of circumstances. That may be one reason Mosasaurus remained so memorable. It was not only fearsome, it was versatile. So the best way to picture Mosasaurus against other sea predators is not as one champion entering an arena for a single final showdown, but as a major player in a rotating cast of dangerous animals. In one sea, the nearest rival might be Prognathodon, with a skull built for harder prey and a taste for turtles. In another, Tylosaurus might still be present, taking elasmosaurs and smaller mosasaurs. Around them, sharks filled adjacent roles and sometimes attacked mosasaurs themselves. Plesiosaurs still occupied part of the upper marine web in some latest Cretaceous settings, even if the details varied by region. Mosasaurus succeeded in that company not because nothing else was dangerous, but because it was built to function well in a sea where several things were. And that is probably the most impressive version of the animal. Not a lone ruler in an empty kingdom, but a predator good enough to hold its place in a crowded one. To do that, it needed more than size and jaws. It needed speed when speed mattered, control when control mattered, and the sensory equipment to make the right decision before the strike ever began. What, then, did it take to stay alive in a sea like that? Not merely to grow large, not merely to win the occasional strike, but to live day after day in a place where food moved quickly, rivals were heavily armed, and danger could arrive from almost any direction. It is easy to picture Mosasaurus only in the moment of attack, when the jaws close and the animal becomes a headline. But most of its life would have been made of everything that happened before that. Finding prey in moving water, judging distance correctly, turning without wasting speed, conserving energy when nothing worth chasing was nearby, surviving injury, growing from a newborn into something large enough that other predators would think twice before approaching. In that sense, life for Mosasaurus was not only about power, it was about management. The body had to gather information, convert that information into movement, and keep doing so in a world where mistakes were expensive. That is why the senses matter so much. A large predator that cannot read its environment is simply a large animal in trouble, and the more dangerous the water, the more valuable each good decision becomes. Vision appears to have been especially important across mosasaurs, and that makes good practical sense. A moving predator in clear or moderately clear water benefits enormously from being able to spot prey early, judge its angle, and commit only when the line is right. A 2015 study on mosasaur sclerotic rings described and compared the eye-supporting rings of 4 genera, including Mosasaurus, confirming that these animals had substantial ocular support structures preserved in the skull. Later work on a halosaurian mosasaur described cranial modifications interpreted as increasing orbit size and binocular vision, which is useful because binocular overlap improves depth judgment during predatory strikes. That does not prove every Mosasaurus species hunted in exactly the same visual manner, and it certainly does not let us pretend we know the colour of its eyes or the exact range of its visual acuity. But it does support the broader point that the visual system mattered. In open water, a predator that relies too heavily on surprise without accurate vision is gambling. A predator that can measure distance well, detect movement quickly, and keep track of prey against a complicated background of light and water has a better chance of making each burst count. There is also some evidence that at least certain mosasaurs were suited to dimmer conditions, though here it pays to be careful and not claim more than the fossils allow. The sclerotic ringwork has been discussed in connection with eye size and potential visual performance, and a more recent study on Pleoplatycarpus found that the large diameter of the sclerotic ring supported enhanced visual sensitivity, even if it did not conclusively prove adaptation to very low light. That is an instructive result because it points toward a sensible middle ground. Mosasaurs were not blind lungers depending on luck, and some seem to have had visual equipment well worth having in a marine setting, where lighting could change rapidly with depth, weather, and suspended particles. For Mosasaurus itself, the safest statement is that it belonged to a lineage in which visual hunting appears to have mattered a great deal. That would have helped not only in catching prey, but in avoiding wasted attacks, tracking rivals, and navigating a space where the difference between a shadow and a meal could close very quickly. Water rewards creatures that notice the difference early. Speed, meanwhile, was not a separate skill from perception. The two had to work together. There is little value in seeing prey beautifully if the body cannot respond well enough to exploit what the eyes have told it. Soft tissue and body form studies have transformed the old image of mosasaurs as overly flexible, eel-like swimmers. A Nature Communications paper on an exceptionally preserved derived mosasaur reported the first indisputable evidence of propulsion by a hypercircle tail fin, and concluded that derived mosasaurs were similar to pelagic sharks in terms of swimming performance. Earlier PLOS-1 work on Platecarpus had already shown that a streamlined body plan and crescent-shaped caudal fin were well established in derived mosasaurs, while another PLOS-1 study on Ectanosaurus integument found features that likely minimized frictional drag and stiffened the front part of the body, limiting major propulsive movements to the posterior body and tail. Put together, these studies describe an animal built not for clumsy thrashing, but for efficient forward motion, controlled approach, and strong tail-driven bursts. Mosasaurus did not need to be the fastest creature in the ocean at all times. It needed to be fast enough at the right moment, and streamlined enough that reaching that moment did not cost too much. That distinction between cruising and bursting is important. A giant predator cannot afford to sprint constantly, especially in a competitive ocean. Energy has to be spent where it matters. The shark-like tail comparisons and rigid front body evidence suggest a swimming style that made this possible. Much of the animal could remain relatively controlled, while the rear body and tail generated the thrust. That is useful during a strike, of course, but it's just as useful during ordinary travel. A hunter covering ground in search of prey benefits from a body that does not waste motion. It also benefits from paddles that steer rather than serve as the main engine, because steering matters when a fish turns, when another mosasaur approaches, or when the attack line has to be corrected in the final instant. This is one reason the phrase ambush predator can mislead if it makes us imagine a slow animal that simply waited around and hoped for the best. The better image is of a predator able to cruise efficiently, hold back its effort, and then convert stored opportunity into rapid movement when conditions favoured it. That is a more demanding way to survive, and also a more realistic one. There is another layer to survival, and it may have been one of the most important of all: body temperature. The old assumption that all large marine reptiles must have functioned more or less like oversized cold-blooded lizards has become much harder to maintain. A 2016 study on oxygen isotopes in mosasaur bioappetite reported elevated body temperatures for multiple mosasaur genera, including values notably higher than coeval marine fish. A 2023 paleobiology study likewise stated that there is strong evidence suggesting mosasaurs could produce metabolic heat and maintain a constant body temperature independent of ambient temperature and latitude. That does not mean every detail of mosasaur thermoregulation is settled beyond argument. There have been disagreements over how best to interpret some of the isotope data, and that is normal in paleobiology. Even so, the overall direction of the later evidence is clear enough to matter. If mosasaurs maintained elevated or partly self-generated body temperatures, that would have improved stamina, widened the range of waters they could exploit, and made them less dependent on warm shallows than a simple reptile stereotype would suggest. In a dangerous ocean, endurance is not a luxury. It is a survival tool. That possibility also changes how we picture their day-to-day range. A hunter with higher, more stable body temperatures can afford more activity, more sustained movement, and potentially a broader latitudinal spread than a strictly temperature-limited reptile of comparable size. The 2023 paleobiology work specifically discusses middle and high-latitude mosasaurs and frames the thermoregulation question in terms of how these animals functioned across different paleolatitudes. Even without claiming that Mosasaurus spent all its time in cold water, the implication is practical. A predator that can keep operating when conditions vary has more options. It can travel farther, recover better after bursts of effort, and remain effective in places where a more temperature-dependent body might be sluggish. That would have mattered not only for hunting but for avoiding other predators and tracking prey that did not stay politely in one thermal band. Ancient seas were not one steady bathtub. Conditions shifted, currents carried change. A lineage that handled that variability better would hold an advantage, and mosasaurs seem to have been among the marine reptiles that did exactly that. Survival also began much earlier than people tend to imagine. We often meet Mosasaurus only as an adult, already large enough to deserve a poster. But every adult began as something small, and a dangerous sea is rarely kind to the small. This is where the evidence for live birth in mosasaurs becomes especially significant. Yale News reported that recently identified neonatal mosasaur specimens from pelagic deposits support the idea that mosasaurs gave birth in the open ocean rather than on shore. The underlying 2015 study summary similarly states that extremely young mosasaurs from a pelagic setting indicate that even neonates occupied open ocean habitats and were likely born there. That tells you something very important about life history. These animals were not crawling onto beaches to lay eggs and leaving hatchlings to scramble into the water like sea turtles. At least the more derived mosasaurs appear to have been fully marine from birth. That means the first challenge in life was not reaching the sea, it was surviving in it immediately. And that in turn implies newborns had to be ready very quickly. Bone microanatomy points in the same direction. A 2012 study on juvenile mosasaur vertebral microanatomy reported that juvenile hydropelvic mosasauroids displayed features comparable to those of adults and concluded that they were probably efficient swimmers from a very young age. That is an extraordinary thing to say about a newborn marine reptile, though perhaps exactly the sort of thing an open ocean birth strategy would demand. A baby in the wrong environment can compensate with shelter, parental care, or a brief protected phase in shallow water. A baby born directly into the sea has fewer excuses. It has to move, orient, and avoid being eaten almost at once. The evidence suggests juvenile advanced mosasaurs were not clumsy experimental versions of the adult body. They were functional swimmers early on. That does not mean the young were safe. Far from it. A dangerous ocean does not stop being dangerous because the newcomer is doing its best. But it does mean the lineage had solved one of the hardest problems in marine life history. How to begin in water without being hopeless there. Once grown, of course, the threats changed rather than disappeared. A large Mosasaurus would have faced rivals from other mosasaurs, sharks and perhaps plesiosaurs depending on the place and time. Evidence of shark bites on mosasaurs, including at least one case involving healing, shows that sharks sometimes attacked living mosasaurs rather than merely scavenging their carcasses. The recent work on late Cretaceous mosasaur communities also shows clear ecological partitioning among large marine predators, which means Mosasaurus was surviving not only against prey, but among competitors. That kind of world favours animals that can read situations quickly. Is the nearby shape prey, rival, scavenger, or threat? Is a turn worth making, or does it expose the flank? Is the wounded prey worth pursuing if other predators are close enough to notice? We do not have a fossilised record of each decision, but we do have the anatomy and the ecology, and together they point to an animal whose survival depended on more than brute force. It needed situational sense. Even a top predator benefits from knowing when to rush and when to hold back. There is also the quieter matter of injury. A body built for force is still a body that can be damaged. Fast turns, struggling prey, collisions during attacks, and encounters with rivals all carry costs. The hydrodynamic studies on mosasaur locomotion are partly so fascinating because they make this easier to imagine in a practical way. A tail-driven hunter living in open water is not simply floating and biting. It is committing its mass to motion again and again, often at close range, often around hard prey or other armed predators. The more specialised the body becomes, the more each major system has to keep working. Damaged flippers reduce control. A jaw injury makes feeding harder. A loss of stamina changes the odds in every chase. Survival in such an environment therefore meant not only being deadly, but being mechanically resilient enough to remain deadly after the ordinary wear and tear of life in a hostile place. That may sound obvious, but it is easy to forget when extinct predators are treated as symbols rather than animals. Symbols do not get tired. Animals do. Symbols do not heal badly. Animals do that too. All of this adds up to a more complete picture of Mosasaurus than the one most people begin with. It was not just a giant mouth attached to a swimming body. It was a marine hunter whose survival depended on information and control. Eyes that likely mattered a great deal. A body capable of efficient cruising and forceful acceleration. A thermoregulatory system that many studies suggest was advanced enough to support elevated body temperatures. A life history that probably began in the open ocean with young already built to swim, and a daily reality shaped by competition, injury risk, and the constant need to make good use of energy in a sea where not everything could be chased and not every confrontation was worth having. That, in the end, may be the most interesting thing about its life. Not that it was fearsome, though it certainly was, but that it was organised. The danger around it was real, and the body met that danger with a suite of solutions that had been tested over millions of years. Yet even that was not enough to guarantee permanence, because survival within an ecosystem is one kind of challenge, and survival through a global catastrophe is quite another. And that is where the scale of the story changes. Up to this point, Mosasaurus has been surviving in the usual difficult way, by being well built, well armed, and well adapted to a dangerous sea. But the end of the Cretaceous was not an ordinary problem of rivals, prey shortages in one bay, or a bad season in one region. It was a planetary problem. A body designed for pursuit, a skull designed for grip, and a lineage that had spent millions of years becoming better and better at marine life can deal with many things. What it cannot do, however, is negotiate with the collapse of the food web beneath it. That is the real beginning of the end for Mosasaurus. Not a duel, not a slow fade into incompetence, not an animal that had stopped being successful. The evidence from museum and scientific summaries points the other way. Large mosasaurs were still present around the world right up to the close of the Cretaceous. In the latest rocks of Morocco, for example, remains of many mosasaur species have been found together, and the Natural History Museum notes that larger mosasaurs were still living worldwide 66 million years ago. That matters because extinction stories are often told as though the animals somehow deserved their ending, as though they had already become weak, outdated, or plainly no longer up to the job. Mosasaurs do not fit that comfortable narrative. The Natural History Museum states that by the end of the Cretaceous they were still thriving, and Smithsonian Magazine describes new evidence from the final remnants of the Western Interior Seaway as showing that large mosasaurs were still present until the very end. There had been environmental changes before the impact, certainly. Some smaller species had already disappeared as temperatures declined from earlier late Cretaceous highs, and falling sea levels were reshaping marine habitats in places such as North America. But that is not the same thing as a lineage already collapsing everywhere. The harsher truth is that mosasaurs were still real, active apex predators in many seas when the larger disaster arrived. Their problem was not that they had failed to adapt to their own world. Their problem was that the world itself was about to stop behaving like the one they had adapted to. Some marine systems were already becoming less stable even before the final blow. Smithsonian Magazine describes how, as sea levels fell and the Western Interior Seaway drained off the continent, parts of that once thriving ecosystem seemed to have turned into a harsher marine setting where the water became more acidic and plankton died off in large numbers. That point is useful because it prevents the ending from becoming too simple. The impact was the decisive event, but local and regional stress was already altering some habitats. Seaways were shrinking, shorelines were moving. Productive marine provinces were changing shape or disappearing. A predator such as Mosasaurus could adapt to a great many things, but even a broad generalist can only work with the prey base and habitat structure available. If one part of the sea grows poorer, the animals must either shift, compress into the remaining good areas, or disappear locally. Still, the key point remains the same. Even in those strained North American settings, the evidence suggests large mosasaurs persisted until the very close of the Cretaceous. The ocean had become harder in places, but it had not yet finished them. Then came the event that the later world would remember in stone. Around 66 million years ago, a roughly 6-mile wide or about 10-kilometer wide asteroid struck near what is now Mexico. Smithsonian Ocean describes the consequences with very little need for embellishment. Tsunamis, acid rain, wildfire, and global cooling followed, while rock vaporized at the impact site was hurled into the atmosphere and acted as a veil that blocked the sun. Britannica likewise identifies the Chicxulub impact as the trigger associated with the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. This is the point where the usual scale of predator and prey stops mattering in the way it did before. Jaws are no help against darkness in the sky. Tail power is no help against the collapse of primary productivity. A top marine predator can dominate an ecosystem only as long as the ecosystem itself continues to function. Once the energy entering that system is sharply reduced, every level above begins to fail in turn. The ocean did not die in one theatrical instant everywhere at once. That is another detail worth holding on to. Smithsonian Ocean says that the effects were global, but it also explains that many organisms outside the immediate impact zone would not have died immediately. Instead, they succumbed as their ecosystems collapsed. Dust and soot lingering in the atmosphere reduce sunlight and warmth. Without enough sunlight, plants on land and phytoplankton in the sea likely died back severely. And without those basic producers, the chains of life above them began to fail. That sequence is probably the most important thing to understand about mosasaur extinction. Mosasaurs were not killed because the impact somehow targeted marine reptiles as a category. They were killed because the base of the system that fed everything below them was damaged so badly that a giant predator at the top had too little left to stand on. In a healthy sea, size and flexibility are advantages. In a collapsing sea, size can become a burden very quickly, because large bodies require large meals, and large meals become scarce first when the ladder beneath them starts losing rungs. The marine victims of this collapse tell the story clearly. Smithsonian Ocean says Ammonites, Large marine reptiles, rudist clams, and many species of phytoplankton were particularly hard hit in the ocean after the impact. Britannica adds that among planktonic marine flora and fauna, only about 13% of coccolithophore and planktonic foraminiferal genera survived, while ammonoids and belemnoids disappeared entirely. It also notes that rudist bivalves vanished, and that marine reptiles such as mosasaurs and plesiosaurs went extinct. That list matters because it shows how many different layers of the marine world were struck at once. Phytoplankton helped support food webs from below. Shell-building plankton and invertebrates were themselves major parts of the marine system. Ammonites were abundant prey animals and important participants in open water ecosystems. Large reptiles occupied upper predatory roles. Remove enough of those pieces in rapid succession, and the whole structure gives way. The extinction was not one creature losing to another. It was an ecological flaw dropping out across the ocean. For Mosasaurus in particular, that loss of prey would have been disastrous. The Natural History Museum says dust from the impact would have blocked sunlight, causing photosynthetic algae to collapse, which in turn would have brought down the rest of the food chain as increasingly larger animals found themselves with nothing to eat. It then states directly that mosasaurs, as top predators, would have been especially vulnerable to the sharp decline in prey, and that all mosasaurs likely died out shortly after the asteroid strike. That phrasing is worth noticing, not because it gives us a dramatic image of one final Mosasaurus swimming alone in a darkened sea, but because it captures the logic of the extinction cleanly. Top predators often look powerful when ecosystems are intact. In a crisis of energy flow, they are among the least buffered animals in the system. A Mosasaurus could switch among prey better than a narrow specialist, but it could not switch to sunlight. It could not skip down the food chain and become a plankton grazer. It could not hibernate on sediment. It lived by large prey in a functioning sea, and once too much of that world vanished, its adaptations stopped having a future. That is one reason the extinction feels so severe when viewed from the perspective of the ancient ocean. This was not merely the disappearance of one charismatic reptile, it was the end of an entire marine order that had become highly successful. Britannica's broader Cretaceous summary notes that giant marine reptiles such as mosasaurs and plesiosaurs were common in the seas, and that the period ended with one of the greatest mass extinctions in Earth's history, exterminating marine and flying reptiles along with many marine invertebrates. In other words, the late Cretaceous ocean was not losing one apex predator and carrying on almost unchanged. It was losing a suite of major marine actors at once. Large marine reptiles vanished. Ammonites vanished. Belemnites vanished. Rudist reef systems disappeared. Major parts of the planktonic world were sharply reduced. When that much structure disappears together, the post-extinction ocean is not simply emptier, it is organised differently. The old routes of energy, the old dominant hunters, and the old ecological arrangements no longer fit. There is also something quietly striking about the timing. Mosasaurs had become dominant marine predators after earlier groups such as ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs had declined or disappeared, and for the last stretch of the Cretaceous they were among the great success stories of the ocean. The Natural History Museum notes that diverse diets and lifestyles allowed many mosasaur species to live alongside one another, without direct competition becoming overwhelming, supporting rich and varied ecosystems right up until the end of the period. That makes their extinction feel less like the closing of a worn-out chapter and more like a sudden interruption. The animals had not run out of evolutionary possibilities. They had not been steadily replaced by a superior marine lineage. The chapter ended because the boundary event was severe enough to remove the conditions that made their success possible in the first place. That is a harsher and more geological kind of ending. It does not care whether the lineage was still innovative, dominant, or impressive. It only cares whether enough of the surrounding world survived for the lineage to keep operating. In the case of mosasaurs, it did not. If you imagine the process in the sea itself, the end probably did not look dramatic in the way films prefer. There was no universal final duel. No single visible moment when one Mosasaurus realized the age of marine reptiles was over. In many regions, the more important changes would have been cumulative and practical. Less prey, fewer familiar animals, collapsing planktonic systems, water conditions altered by the wider atmospheric consequences of the impact. Smithsonian Ocean describes the aftereffects as including global cooling, blocked sunlight, and widespread ecosystem collapse, while Smithsonian Magazine points to acidified and biologically stressed seaway waters in some late Cretaceous settings. In a world like that, extinction would not have looked like a crown falling. It would have looked like hunting becoming less reliable, distances between meals becoming longer, and the ordinary logic of survival failing one layer at a time. For a large predator, that is perhaps the bleakest kind of ending. Not defeat in combat, but the gradual disappearance of the very things that made combat, feeding, and movement worthwhile. And yet, as final as that loss was for Mosasaurus, the ocean did not remain empty forever. Smithsonian Ocean notes that after the asteroid collision some organisms began to make a comeback, and that the K/PG extinction cleared the way for new lineages to thrive. Mammals, once small and mostly overshadowed in the Mesozoic, diversified in new directions, and some of those lineages much later gave rise to whales, seals, and manatees in the ocean. That is one of history's most remarkable substitutions. The sea that once held giant marine lizards would, over millions of years, become the home of giant marine mammals. Not immediately, and not because one was waiting politely off stage while the other exited, but because extinction opened ecological space and evolution eventually filled it with different bodies solving some of the same problems. The old sea kings vanished, and much later entirely different animals learned how to rule water in their place. It is a useful reminder that extinction does not stop life. It changes who gets the next chance. Still, there is no direct replacement for Mosasaurus itself. Whales are not reptilian echoes. Sharks are not leftovers from its rule. Modern seas have their own great predators, but none are quite this combination of giant lizard ancestry, socketed recurved teeth, flexible prey-handling jaws, and tail-driven marine specialization. That is why the extinction of Mosasaurus feels so complete. When dinosaurs disappeared on land, birds remained as living descendants. When mosasaurs disappeared, there was no equivalent continuation. Squamates survived the K/PG event in other forms, but mosasaurs as a marine dynasty were done. Britannica notes that lizards and snakes overall were only slightly affected compared with some marine groups, yet mosasaurs themselves were among the reptilian lineages lost at the boundary. So the family tree continued in broad terms, but this particular marine branch was cut cleanly away. That is the sort of loss that leaves no true modern comparison, only distant relatives and educated imagination. There is something fitting, perhaps, in the fact that Mosasaurus helped early scientists think seriously about extinction itself. The Natural History Museum points out that the fossils of Mosasaurus later helped inform George Cuvier's work on the reality of extinction, a radical idea in its time. That gives the animal a strange second life. It vanished in the K/PG catastrophe with the rest of its world, but millions of years later its bones became part of the human effort to understand that worlds can end, species can disappear, and the history of life is not a straight line of continuous presence. In that sense, the fall of Mosasaurus did not only clear space in ancient seas, it also helped clear space in human thought. The animal became proof that life changes not only by addition, but by loss. And that lesson, once noticed, changed science. So the fall of this sea predator was not a story of weakness. It was the story of a highly successful marine reptile meeting a boundary event large enough to take the whole system down around it. The seas that had once supported chalk-forming plankton, abundant ammonites, shell builders, fish, sharks, plesiosaurs, and many kinds of mosasaurs could no longer support the same structure after the impact. Food webs collapsed. Major marine groups vanished. The Cretaceous ended, and with it the age in which Mosasaurus could exist at all. That is the truth behind the extinction, Not a fading legend, not an animal slipping quietly out of relevance, a real predator, still formidable, still present, and then caught in one of the worst ecological failures the planet has ever endured. Which is perhaps why it remains so powerful in the imagination now. It did not disappear because it became ordinary. It disappeared because the world around it stopped being its world. And that leaves one last part of the story waiting just ahead, because even after the body's gone and the ocean has changed, Mosasaurus still has a way of staying with us. Not simply because it was large, though it certainly was. Not simply because it had a mouthful of recurved teeth, though that part does tend to leave an impression. And not simply because it lived in an age already crowded with animals that seem almost designed to make modern life feel pleasantly safe by comparison. It stays with us because it feels real in a way many extinct animals do not, and once you understand what it actually was, that feeling only grows stronger. By now, the outline is probably settled quite firmly in the mind. A marine reptile, not a dinosaur. A giant squamate shaped by the sea into a highly effective predator. A body built for efficient movement, a tail made for thrust, jaws designed not only to seize prey but to keep it moving in the one direction that mattered. A hunter living among other hunters in warm late Cretaceous waters that were full of fish, sharks, cephalopods, turtles, and other marine reptiles. Not a fantasy creature assembled from pieces, but a real evolutionary answer to a real ecological problem. Once you see that clearly, Mosasaurus becomes harder to file away as a mere monster. It becomes something more interesting than that. It becomes an animal that makes the ancient ocean feel inhabited. There is a difference between knowing that prehistoric life was dramatic and actually feeling the structure of it. Many people grow up with a general sense that the past was full of giant things. Dinosaurs were large. Ancient sharks were large. Marine reptiles were large. There were teeth everywhere, and one assumes that nobody had a restful afternoon. But size alone is not what gives an extinct animal staying power. What gives it staying power is coherence, the feeling that all the parts belong together, that the animal had a place in the world and that the world in turn made sense around it. Mosasaurus has that quality in abundance. The sea explains the tail, the prey explains the jaws, the competition explains the versatility, the extinction explains the absence. And once the picture locks into place like that, the imagination keeps returning to it, because it no longer feels like a loose collection of facts, it feels like a life. That is one reason the early discovery of Mosasaurus mattered so much. The first known Mosasaurus fossils were found near Maastricht in the 18th century, long before the word dinosaur had even been coined, and the animal was named in 1822 as Meuse lizard, after the river associated with the city. Scientists first argued over whether the remains belonged to a fish, crocodile or whale, before the reptilian identity became clear, and the fossils later played an important part in changing how scholars thought about extinction itself. There is something almost fitting about that history. Mosasaurus did not arrive in human thought as a fully explained thing. It arrived as a puzzle, a skull in stone, teeth in rock, a shape that suggested power without immediately revealing what kind. That feels appropriate because the animal still works on us in almost exactly that way. We see the outline first, then the questions begin. What was it? How did it move? What did it eat? What could possibly have eaten it, or survived beside it? Why does it look, at once, vaguely familiar and completely wrong for the modern sea? Why does a giant lizard in water feel somehow more unsettling than a giant fish, even though the practical outcome for a smaller animal would have been equally unpleasant? Part of the answer is that reptiles still live with us. Sharks feel ancient, certainly, but they are already creatures of the sea in our minds. A giant extinct shark is an enlargement of an existing idea. Mosasaurus does something stranger. It takes a branch of life we know from land and reworks it into a giant marine hunter. The result feels like a category breach. The mind accepts whales. The mind accepts sharks. The mind has less practice with the phrase giant sea lizard. especially when that lizard could rival the top marine predators of its age. That element of familiarity warped into something larger and more aquatic is part of what keeps Mosasaurus vivid. It is close enough to the living world to feel possible, and far enough from it to feel deeply unsettling. And unlike some extinct animals that survive mostly as names, Mosasaurus survives as a scene. People do not merely remember the classification, they remember the water. They remember the mouth opening beneath the surface in some documentary, museum mural, childhood book or film sequence that lodged itself in the mind and refused to leave. The animal has entered public imagination not as a line in a table, but as movement through dark water. That matters more than it might seem. Certain extinct creatures live mainly as skeletons. Mosasaurus lives as approach. Perhaps that is because the sea itself still does half the work. Even now, with maps, sonar submersibles and cameras, the ocean keeps enough of its distance from us to remain a useful home for ancient fear. We know more than our ancestors did, but we are not masters of it in any simple sense. Deep water still hides scale. It still removes the ground beneath us. It still turns direction into something less certain. Up and down remain. Beyond that, confidence begins to thin out. So when an extinct predator is placed in that environment, the imagination has plenty of room to help. It does not have to force the mood. The setting is already doing it quietly in the background. Yet what is striking about Mosasaurus is that the science does not make it smaller. Often, when you learn the details behind a famous prehistoric animal, some of the drama fades. The animal turns out to be less extreme than the posters promised, or more limited, or more ordinary in the practical business of survival. With Mosasaurus, the opposite often happens. The real version becomes more impressive because it becomes more specific. It was not just a vague giant, it was a marine squamate. It was not just a frightening mouth, it was a feeding system with socketed teeth, jaw flexibility, and palate teeth that helped manage difficult prey. It was not just a large shape in the water, it was a tail-driven predator with a specialized swimming body. The details do not drain the life from it, they tighten it. That tightening is, in a quiet way, one of the pleasures of paleontology. The better the evidence becomes, the more convincing the animal becomes. A well-preserved tail makes the swimming clearer, gut contents make the menu clearer, isotopes make the habitat clearer, skull mechanics make the feeding clearer. None of these things turn Mosasaurus into something smaller than the myth. They turn it into something stronger than the myth, because myth is loose and real anatomy is stubborn. A made-up monster can do anything because it answers to nothing. A real extinct predator is bound by mechanics, history and ecology, and if it still emerges as formidable after all that, the effect is much more durable. That may be why Mosasaurus still works so well in museums and popular culture. The public does not need to be tricked into finding it compelling. The animal arrives with built-in scale, a memorable silhouette, and a setting people already half fear. The scientific truth adds rather than subtracts. It helps that the name is memorable too. Mosasaurus is one of those names that sounds immediately complete, as though it already knows it belongs to a predator. Some names need a paragraph of explanation before they settle properly in the ear. This one does not. It arrives ready. Even popular misreadings of Mosasaurus tell us something useful. People call it a dinosaur because dinosaur has become shorthand for prehistoric greatness, and they call it whale-like because the body speaks the language of marine adaptation so well that the mind reaches automatically for the largest familiar swimmer it knows. Both comparisons are technically wrong, but both are revealing. They show that Mosasaurus occupies a kind of crossroads in public imagination. It carries the grandeur people associate with dinosaurs and the aquatic authority they associate with whales, while actually belonging to neither group. That makes it hard to forget. It slips through simple labels, and things that slip through labels tend to stay interesting. There is also, I think, a simpler human reason for its staying power. People are fascinated by competence. We like animals that are not merely dramatic but good at what they do. A tiger is compelling not because it is striped, but because it is such a finished expression of stalking and force. An orca is compelling not because it is black and white, but because it is so clearly built for coordinated hunting. Mosasaurus has that same quality once you look past the headline. It feels finished. Not in the sense of being perfect, because no animal is perfect, but in the sense of being fully committed to its way of life. Nothing about it feels undecided. It is marine all the way through. It is predatory all the way through. It is one of those extinct animals that gives the impression of having known exactly what job it had. And then, of course, there is the ending, which gives the whole thing its final shape. Mosasaurs did not fade out because they were becoming less impressive. They remained among the dominant marine predators of the late Cretaceous right up to the end, and then the end Cretaceous extinction removed the world that sustained them. The same fossil history that made Mosasaurus famous also helped later scientists understand that extinction is real, that entire kinds of life can vanish, and that the Earth does not guarantee permanence even to successful lineages. That matters to the imagination more than we usually admit. A predator that loses a duel is merely defeated. A predator that loses its whole world becomes something else in memory. It becomes a marker of time itself. Mosasaurus is not just frightening because of what it could do. It is haunting because it belongs entirely to a vanished sea. There is no modern shoreline where one might plausibly appear. There is no surviving descendant carrying on the same marine dynasty in reduced form. The broader squamate line survives, yes, in lizards and snakes, but mosasaurs themselves are finished. Their branch of the story ends cleanly at the boundary. That kind of total absence gives an animal a strange afterlife. It cannot return except in bone, reconstruction, and thought, so it returns there instead. It returns in museum halls, where a suspended skull or skeleton can make a room feel briefly smaller. It returns in documentaries, where slow narration and dark blue water do some of the same work they have always done on the human mind. It returns in books read by children who are still at the perfect age for loving giant ancient things, without yet feeling obliged to be sensible about it. It returns in scientific papers, where each new specimen adds another hard-edged detail to an animal that has already outlived its own body by tens of millions of years. It returns in conversations whenever someone says, quite reasonably, that the ocean is already alarming enough without remembering what used to live in it. And perhaps it returns most of all in the odd private way that certain extinct animals do, becoming attached to moods rather than only to facts. Tyrannosaurus often belongs to daylight, dust, impact, the violence of the land. Pterosaurs belong to sky and open height. Mosasaurus belongs to evening water, to depth, to the surface that hides more than it shows. Even when the facts are clear and the reconstructions precise, it still carries that atmosphere with it. Not because the animal was supernatural, it was not. But because the sea remains one of the few settings in modern life that still preserves some of the old conditions for awe. Distance, obscurity, scale, uncertainty. Mosasaurus fits there so naturally in the mind that it almost feels as if memory itself has salt water in it. There is also something quietly satisfying in knowing that the bones of such an animal helped change science. The discovery near Maastricht, the later debates over what the fossil was, and its role in the growing recognition that extinction was a real feature of Earth's history, mean that Mosasaurus matters not only as an ancient predator, but as part of the history of ideas. It helped people understand that the world had once held creatures unlike any alive now, and that those creatures had truly been lost. That is a rather grand second career for a marine reptile. First, dominate a late Cretaceous sea. Then, after a suitably long pause in limestone, help persuade humans that nature has a history full of arrivals and disappearances. Not bad, really, as fossil legacies go. And so, here we are at the end of our quiet time with it. We began with a headline-sized image, the ocean predator that could swallow sharks, and followed it down into something much fuller. A real animal in a real sea, a hunter with rivals, with prey, with a body shaped by millions of years of marine living. A predator that could be terrifying without ever needing to become nonsense. And now, after all the jaws and tails and fossil clues and vanished coastlines, what remains is not only the image of danger, but the feeling of perspective. Because that is part of what ancient animals do for us when we sit with them long enough. They make the present feel narrower and larger at the same time. Narrower because our own span is brief, and our familiar world is only one arrangement among many the planet has worn. Larger because once you let the Cretaceous see into the mind, the world gains another layer of reality. There were once warm inland seas over lands that are dry now. There were once reptiles in those waters solving the same basic problems modern marine hunters solve, but in their own reptilian way. There were once skulls under that water that no human would see until stone carried them forward. If this has done anything gentle for your evening, perhaps it is simply that. A small widening of the sense of time, a reminder that the world has been busy for a very long while, and that your own room, your own hour, your own ordinary little corner of the present sits on top of an older earth than daily life usually allows us to notice. Somewhere beneath that ordinary feeling are vanished coastlines, chalk seas, Ammonites, sharks, drifting plankton, and the shape of Mosasaurus moving through water that has not existed for 66 million years. And yet, in another sense, it still exists a little, not in the sea itself, not in hidden trenches waiting to surprise us, which I should say plainly lest the imagination get too enthusiastic, but in the evidence, in the fossils, in the reconstructions, in the clear, stubborn fact that such an animal once lived, and that we can know it well enough to picture its world with real confidence. That is the quiet triumph here. Not that the predator survived, because it did not, but that its reality did. So if you have found some calm in this long drift through an older ocean, if the ancient sea has been more soothing than alarming, and if spending this time with Mosasaurus has made the evening a little softer around the edges, I would be very grateful if you liked the video, perhaps subscribed, and stayed with Life Beyond Seen for another slow journey soon. There are many old worlds left to wander through, and most of them are safer from the comfort of a blanket. For now, though, you can let the image settle, the sea growing dim, the surface quiet again, the great marine reptile no longer charging toward the camera or bursting from some exaggerated fantasy, but returning instead to its proper place, an animal of the late Cretaceous, fully real, fully gone, and still strangely alive in the mind. Wherever you are listening from tonight, and whatever hour has gathered around you by now, I hope the room feels a little stiller than it did before. I hope the day has loosened its grip, and I hope that somewhere between fossil bone, ancient water, and the slow rhythm of this telling, sleep has begun to find you. Rest well, and let the old sea keep its distance now.